Testing.
We're ready to start.
Okay, testing. Okay, everyone. Welcome to our conference on animal consciousness. That's not going to keep going for the whole conference, is it? Hi out there to anyone on the live stream. There's still a fair amount of room here if you want to come by. So this conference is a production of the NYU Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, the Center for Bioethics, and the Animal Studies Initiative. I'm David Chavez, the co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, along with Ned Block. The Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness was set up here at NYU about 4 or 5 years ago with a brief to study foundational issues in the mind-brain sciences. And as part of that, we organize a series of debates, events, research programs, but also a major annual conference. So some of you were along last year at our conference on the ethics of artificial intelligence. The year before, there was one on Is the Brain Bayesian? Before that, there was one on brain mapping initiatives and measuring borderline states of consciousness. But this year, it's on the subject of animal consciousness. I think a topic of really a lot of current and ongoing interest. We're joined this year by the Center for Bioethics, with whom we've organized events in the past, directed by Matthew Lerell, who's co-organized the conference. They're set up, they've been studying all kinds of relevant ethical issues that arise from biology, from technology, with a lot of connection to these issues about animals. And for the first time this year, we're joined by the Animal Studies Initiative, represented here by Dale Jamieson, who's also co-organizing the conference. The Animal Studies Initiative is part of the Department of Environmental Sciences at NYU, engaged in all kinds of interesting issues to do with animals. They've just now set up an MA program, which will be starting next fall, and right now admitting students for the first time in the ongoing graduate admissions process. Dale will probably get up here this afternoon and say a few words about that MA program for any of you who may be interested. We're very grateful to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at NYU for all their support of these initiatives and these events, as well as the College of Global Public Health, which runs the Center for which houses the Center for Bioethics, for all their support. We're also grateful to the Cantor Film Center and to all of our amazing administrators, helpers, organizers, John Simon, Cassie Cost from Bioethics, and a whole army of grad students and postdocs who are helping out. So thanks to all of you. So our topic here is animal consciousness. Consciousness in animals. We've got an amazing program, I think, lined up for the next couple of days, going through issues about animals at many different levels of complexity, about many different philosophical and scientific issues that arise. The program, like all of the conferences we've organized, the program here is interdisciplinary. We've got philosophers, we've got scientists from many different areas on the agenda. Some of us, it's fair to say, come to animals from the study of consciousness. Some of us come to consciousness from the study of animals. Speaking for myself, it's very much in the direction of starting with consciousness, and those of us in the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness have been thinking about consciousness for many years, and of course, you can't escape the issue of the distribution of consciousness in animals and what kind of character consciousness might have in animals. Theories of consciousness have really been developed in many, in an extraordinary smorgasbord of theoretical options over the last few years, both within philosophy and within science. Some theories have come to be favored, and I think it's time to step back and look at what does the progress we've made on consciousness say about the question of animals, as well as taking the question of animals as a challenge point for any theory of consciousness. If you can't say something plausible and well-grounded about consciousness in animals, there's going to be serious limits on your theory. So that's one direction, coming from consciousness to animals. I think many other people here are coming from animals to consciousness. We've got people here, both scientists and philosophers, who have thought about animals, issues about animals for many years, whether, say, issues about cognition and complex behavior in animals, or ethical issues about animals. And whether you're coming, say, from this scientific or ethical perspective on animals, issues about consciousness can soon become hard to avoid. Certainly, if you're thinking about animal cognition and animal behavior, the question inevitably arises, what kind of consciousness, what kind of subjective experience might be lying behind the relevant behavior or the relevant kinds of cognition? And I think a number of scientists have been increasingly turning to that question. If you're thinking about ethical issues about animals, something I know a lot of people here are very concerned about, and animal rights, what our appropriate duties are toward animals, to many people, the question of consciousness then becomes front and center. Many people think it's insofar as animals are conscious beings that they have some kind of moral status, and the question of whether different non-human animals are conscious and what kind of consciousness they may have is crucial to our ethical treatment of them. So I think there's at least some thought or some hope that a better understanding of animal consciousness might help us to get somewhat clearer on our ethical duties towards animals. So these are all issues we'll be exploring as the conference goes along. I mean, there are issues about which non-human animals are conscious. What is the distribution of consciousness in the domain of animals? When did consciousness first arise along an evolutionary timescale? That kind of issue will be, I think, a central focus this morning, so I'll say more about that in a moment. There will be issues about what kind of consciousness is found in different animals. Not so much about the existence of consciousness, but about the character of consciousness. Tom Nagel, famously back in 1974, wrote the article, "What is it like to be a bat?" About what can we know about the consciousness of an animal very different from ourselves, where are there limits on what we know? Well, in the meantime, many people have been working away on many different animal species. Over the course of this conference, perhaps we'll hear at least something about what is it like to be an octopus, what is it like to be a dog, what is it like to be a dolphin, and perhaps even what is it like to be a bee. So these are issues about the subjective character of consciousness. They raise many philosophical issues, epistemological issues. How can we know? Issues in the philosophy of science. What's the appropriate methodology for coming to study these questions about the character of consciousness? And then, of course, there are going to be ethical and associated political and legal issues about how does consciousness bear on our ethical duties towards animals. So I think over the course, and the question how does all this connect to theories of consciousness? How does thinking clearly about animals help us clarify our theories of consciousness, and how do theories of consciousness help us get straight on issues about animals? So over the course of the conference, we'll be looking at all of those questions over the next 5 sessions. I think our sessions are evolution, invertebrates, and early vertebrates. This morning, a special session on whether fish feel pain in the early afternoon, ethical issues in the late afternoon. Tomorrow morning, theories of consciousness meet animal consciousness. Tomorrow afternoon, emotion and self-consciousness in animals, and then a final panel discussion. I should say we're also having a reception, which is not on the program, this evening at 6 p.m. across the square at 40 Washington Square South, featuring special guest lecture from a local rapper known to some of you. Baba Brinkman, the author of the Rap Guide to Consciousness, will perform a couple of numbers. So you're all invited to that. Okay, I think it's just about 9:30. Time to get started. So I will now transition to introducing the first session. So the first session is on invertebrates, early vertebrates, and the evolution of consciousness. So issues about when and where did consciousness arise in evolution, and what kinds of consciousness can we expect to find in relatively simple organisms like invertebrates and simple vertebrates. I think this is in some ways, indicative of how the field and the orientation in this field has gradually transformed over the years. I mean, when it comes to questions about the distribution of consciousness, René Descartes famously thought, okay, humans only. Any non-human organism is not going to be conscious at all. And that view it's still out there that consciousness, maybe that consciousness requires language or something akin to it. But over the years, attitudes towards the ascription of consciousness in both science and philosophy have liberalized. A few years ago, the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness was signed, which declared that consciousness is present in, I think it was all mammals, some birds, and octopuses. So octopuses get treated here as honorary vertebrates, and I think even under law in some places. And now, we're finding now that people are now prepared to at least countenance the idea of consciousness more and more broadly. So we'll have talk here on consciousness in insects, and so on. In the afternoon, we'll be thinking about fish. So that's where, I think right now that's the locus of questions about which organisms are consciousness and where did it arise in evolution has gradually broadened to the point where we really can at least entertain these questions about consciousness in invertebrates and vertebrates, look at the evidence, and then think seriously about what this tells us, or how this interfaces with issues about how consciousness evolved. And I think all of our speakers in this first session have thought about those issues and how they interact. What kind of consciousness you'll find in simple organisms, and how this interfaces with questions about evolution. So I think this is going to be a very exciting session because of that. 4 speakers coming at this topic in 4 different ways. Our first speaker is Peter Godfrey-Smith from the University of Sydney. Peter's done well-known, really interesting work in both the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of mind, really specializing in empirically grounded thought about cognition in human and non-human organisms. Many of you will know his recent book, Other Minds, which really focuses especially on the octopus and on consciousness in octopuses and what it may be like. It's been something of a bestseller, I gather, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend it to you. It's a wonderful book to read. Today, Peter's going to talk to us about animal evolution and subjective experience. So please welcome our first speaker, Peter Godfrey-Smith.
Okay, so what I'll do in this talk is give a sketch of animal evolution and some relevant phylogenetic relationships, then locate in that framework some features that seem likely to matter to subjective experience and talk about their history. Do these things arise once or often? Do they tend to cluster or dissociate? I'll then outline cautiously how I think everything might fit together, and lastly, I'll say something about the special case of the octopus. Okay, my title says subjective experience. The conference title says consciousness. These are often seen as the same, especially here at NYU. at least for one sense of the word consciousness, I think there's a little bit of a problem. I think consciousness inevitably suggests a rich human kind of subjective experience. And many discussions, especially around here, tend to set that aside. They say consciousness is just the fact of there being something it's like to be a particular kind of system, in Nagel's phrase. Okay, that's fine, but I think the richer associations tend to return moments after the weak sense has been endorsed and make the problem look harder. So I think subjective experience is a better word for the target, but I'm going to speak the local language here much of the time. Okay, the history of animals has the shape of a tree. Animals are a branch or a subtree within a larger tree of life, a structure which outside of animals is not so reliably tree-like. This tree-based framework I use here is not employed with any philosophical claim about the nature of species or anything like that. It just represents what happened. All present-day animals are linked by common ancestry to various degrees of temporal depth. So there's a first picture of the tree, and you read that with time running up the screen. It's very incomplete with respect to which groups are included, and it mixes taxonomic ranks, which is not a problem. But that gives you a first picture of the history. People still sometimes talk of a phylogenetic scale. They might ask, where in the phylogenetic scale did consciousness arise? There's no such thing as a phylogenetic scale. A scale is an ordering, a matter of higher and lower. In a tree like this, there is higher versus lower in the sense of earlier versus later, but no one alive now is lower in that sense. There's also a distinction between simple and complex, but there are many different kinds of complexity and no single scale. A tree is just a different kind of thing, and animals form or are part of a tree. Now, animals arose something like 700 to 900 million years ago, and I'll describe the sequence of branchings in a way organised by the relations between various present-day animals. So one early branching, down the bottom of the screen, led on one side to sponges, and on the other side to everyone or nearly everyone else. Later, a branching occurred that led on one side to cnidarians, jellyfish, corals, and anemones on one side, and bilaterians on the other. So bilaterians, or bilaterally symmetrical animals, are animals like us that have a left and right side as well as an up and down, and they include most of the familiar animals. Now, nervous systems may have evolved once or perhaps twice. Everybody, or nearly everybody, on the big branch that includes cnidarians and bilaterians has a nervous system. Sponges have no nervous systems. They're the only animals marked on the slide that have no nervous systems. The bilaterian line then splits into two sides. I have labelled the protostomes and the deuterostomes. We are deuterostomes, as are starfish. Protostomes include most of the familiar invertebrates, insects, crustaceans, which are both arthropods, mollusks, various kinds of worms, and they also form two big branches. I've marked there also a particular animal, the bilaterian last common ancestor, as a particular important stage in the history of animal life. Now, many of the branchings mentioned so far took place in the Ediacaran, the first period with any fossil record of animals, 635 to 540 million years ago. There's a reconstruction of Ediacaran life by the English artist John Nowak. This was a time of ambiguous forms, many of which lived fixed in place or drifted, while a few others probably crawled, grazing microbial mats. Then we reach the Cambrian explosion from 540 million years or so ago, which sees the sudden appearance of bodies with hard parts and obvious means for complex behaviour: legs, claws, and sophisticated eyes. Now, three groups which diverged in the Ediacaran, that's the orange band at the bottom of the screen, eventually produced some species showing conspicuous behavioural complexity. The three groups are arthropods, especially some insects, spiders and crabs, vertebrates like us, and a particular group of mollusks called cephalopods, especially the octopus. So as you can see, those groups diverged early in the Ediacaran and evolved behavioural complexity later and independently. As Michael Tressman has put it, these three groups contain species with complex active bodies, animals with the capacity for rapid and directed movement, manipulation of objects, and sensory tracking of objects in space. They also have complex nervous systems that enable this. So we can start by recognising three origins for complex behaviour and large nervous systems, though it's possible to split more finely. And these animals all seem like initial candidates in some sense for subjective experience. But we've not said enough, surely, to make much of a link to that question yet. There's not been much bridging of the gap, so next we can start looking for some more specific features. Well, the pointer we would get from a huge amount of recent work is look at the sensory side. For many thinkers, subjective experience is either inherently sensory, or this is the paradigm case. For some people, this claim goes via a representationalist view of qualia, but other views have a similar sensory focus without that. Now, sensing of some sort is ubiquitous, not just in animals, but in all known cellular life. But there are differences in complexity that might be relevant. So what I'll do here is just look at the particular case of vision, a sense with unique importance in animal evolution. So which kinds of animals have eyes that can form a usable image and, with the aid of downstream processing, present objects in space? You might think that that is an important feature in the evolution of subjective experience. Well, Dan Erik Nielsen discusses 4 classes of eyes, 1 to 4, with class 4 being high resolution, eyes that enable high resolution vision. Those eyes evolved perhaps 3 to 4 times with 2 different designs: the camera eye of vertebrates and cephalopods and the compound eye of arthropods. So the groups in which these eyes arose are the same 3 groups that were picked out earlier more generally. Now myself, I don't think that perception is the key to subjective experience. In arguing that there is non-sensory conscious experience, people often use cases like moods and also cognitive phenomenology, the experience of thinking or remembering things. Now I agree with both sets of arguments. I had the example in my Jack Smart lecture of energy level, fatigue and its relatives to the list. I think not all subjective experience is presentation of facts or things. There's also just a way that some internal states and processes feel. Now, there's a family of approaches that look beyond sensing in a particular way. They start from the idea that a plausible early form of consciousness is evaluative or affective. Feelings, especially washes of positive and negative affect, might be basic and widespread forms of subjective experience. Now, valuing, like sensing, in some form is ubiquitous, but there might be some forms with special relevance to the problem. An idea that's been picked up by various people is a possible link between consciousness and instrumental learning, which is learning by tracking the good and bad consequences of your actions. There are other kinds of evaluative sophistication that include especially trade-offs, as seen in Robert Elwood's well-known work on hermit crabs, but I'll make my next point just with the aid of learning itself. Now, instrumental learning appears to be scattered through the animal tree in a way that suggests it involved several times. It's present in vertebrates and cephalopods and some arthropods, very prominent in bees. But it has not yet been seen in all arthropods, including some behaviourally complex ones, such as wasps and spiders. Spiders are occasionally said to show instrumental learning, but I think the standard citation given there is generally misdescribed and does not support this. Now, this raises the possibility of a dissociation between features relevant to subjective experience. I think we can imagine, at least in principle, an animal with a very sophisticated sensory side and much simpler evaluation, an animal that's sort of more robotic on the evaluative side. And then we can also imagine the flip side. Perhaps an animal with less of an idea of what's going on around it, but with a stronger sense of whether what's going on is good or bad. Now, is that second option harder to make sense of? The possible asymmetry there is reflected, I think, in possible facts about distribution. For the first combination, rich sensing and simpler evaluation, we have various terrestrial arthropods, and the combination makes sense there. Arthropods that live on land often have short lives dominated by routine. by a definite and restricted set of actions. Complex actions, but regimented ones. They don't live very open lives, but they face considerable sensory motor demands, especially the ones that can fly. On the other side, rich evaluation, simpler sensing, there are no cases, I think, that are as clear, but perhaps gastropods, the group that includes slugs and snails. They can do at least some instrumental learning, but they have much simpler eyes than other such learners. So there's a summary slide, very tentative for this part of the treatment. The slide has purple for complexity on both the evaluative and the sensory sides, blue for the sensory side only, red for the evaluative side only. I think the colours are coming through okay. Now, if there's a problem with this slide, I think it's one of making the gulfs wider than they really are. One thing it illustrates in principle, though, is the possibility of different evolutionary paths to things that are different from each other, but each of which would amount or might amount to a form of subjective experience. Or perhaps less starkly, there might be at least paths which are with a much redder or bluer tinge. Now, I'll leave that slide up there and then press to a still finer grain of analysis. From here, there are further traits with somewhat more ambiguous role in some ways that might be still better as bridging traits with respect to the mental and the physical. One is integration of the senses to yield a multimodal model of the world. Relatedly, there's integration of sensory input and the present state of the body, and integration of what you're sensing with which actions you take as an animal to be underway. Through the evolution, especially of traits of that last couple of kinds, an animal becomes a centre of action and perception in a way that is not true of other living things. And one consequence of becoming a centre of agency and perception of this kind is the animal's gaining a sense of itself as such a thing. As emphasised by Bjorn Merker, a mobile animal is continually generating by its own actions sensory inputs that must be disambiguated, that must be registered as self-caused rather than being informative about external changes. As another Bjorn Brems, has also noted, instrumental learning requires something of the same kind. The animal must register what it's doing or has just done, as opposed to what has merely happened. So competent agency in a mobile animal that can actively manipulate objects requires some registration, perhaps tacit, of that animal's own agency. Now, of the things that I've put on the table now, complex sensing, complex evaluation, integration, registration of one's own agency, I am not sure how they fit together biologically or which are the most important to the problems at hand. Which ones are more or less incidental to the problem, which ones are less so. I'm also not sure how deep the differences in style might be, the sorts of differences put on a slide like that. But suppose we had a filled out theory of this general kind. What contribution would it make? I think a theory like this, when filled out, would be a theory of subjectivity. I think of that as the right bridging concept here. Once we have an animal with all that in some appropriate combination, we have the activities of a subject. Subjective experience is some of what goes on in systems of that kind. It's part of what they undergo. Now, some bits of standard descriptions of the problem encourage this kind of bridging. So Nagel says in a couple of places that the main problem here is explaining in naturalistic terms how a subjective point of view could come to be part of a material world. And that's exactly what a theory of this kind would give us. Subjective experience is the biology of subjectivity from the subject's point of view. And subjects, in turn, are comprehensible evolutionary products. Now, to fill this out a little in the last few minutes, I'll make some comments about how a theory with this general shape relates to some other lines of argument that might seem to push away from the sort of story being told here, and might also seem to push away from the existence of subjective experience in animals far from us. So this is work that might be taken to suggest it's not right that subjective experience is basically just the first-person point of view on what complex animals do. Now, one message of that sort is taken from current research on the human side, and this can be described as argument for a kind of selectivity. So Dehane and Milner and Goodale would be good names to mention in this connection. The argument is that lots of what we do, including quite complicated things, is not conscious. And these things seem to include a lot of the basic activity of getting by, perception, some basic kinds of learning, and the guidance of action. We humans seem to do lots of that in the dark, and those activities might seem to include a lot of what other animals get up to. So an argument that might be given, and I don't know if this has been made explicitly or if it's really a sort of tacit argument, is something like this. Because we can do a lot of basic activities unconsciously, taken together, this might suggest that it's possible to have an entire behavioural profile of the sort seen in animals that is unconscious. But that would not follow. It might be true, but it does not follow. In the human experiments that motivate this view, the subjects are conscious, though they may not be conscious of everything they do. There's no reason for this kind of work to think that because at any time some of what we do is done unconsciously, that it could be all that way at once. It might instead be that once you are an awake human subject doing the usual sort of stuff, some of it has to be conscious. And this point can apply even setting aside the sorts of high attention, temporally demanding tasks of the sort emphasised by Dehane that seem to never be done unconsciously. Okay, I'm going to skip the second one for time, which involves an argument due to Hakwon Lau. Another challenge that I'll discuss more briefly could be seen not as a challenge to the argument, but as a challenge to us. So I discussed a range of subjectivity relevant properties, properties that look like partial gap closures in different ways. These all have simpler forms, running over the tree of animal life and outside of animals to some degree. So if these features are subjectivity relevant in general, is that only true of their complex forms, or is it true of all forms? Now, I don't know. To me, though, it does appear that the closer we look on the biological side, the more graded the relevant properties are turning out to be. So those sensory and evaluative transitions I discussed earlier, class 4 eyes, instrumental learning, these are all surrounded by various sorts of close approaches, near misses, and partial cases. Now this leaves open the possibility that there is some reason why only some values of those variables, only complex forms, are even relevant to subjective experience. I don't see that, but I don't think we know it to be true or false. A true gradualism about subjective experience is both the more difficult option to think about, but I think given our empirical picture, also the more natural option, the one that makes more sense. If so, we would have to move beyond an account of which features might suffice to make an animal an experiencing subject, to an account of how having richer versions of those features implies internal goings-on that are more rather than less experiential. You have to describe things in something like that form. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit to make sure I don't lose my octopuses at the end. I'll think just a little bit about the special case of the octopus. I think of this as the sort of flagship case for an argument about multiple independent origins of subjective experience. I think that most likely some arthropods do have subjective experience. There's something it's like to be a crab and probably something it's like to be a bee. But the octopus is the kind of stronger case. It's the most neurally complex invertebrate with something like 500 million neurons. Octopuses firstly have all the basics I've discussed here. On both sensory and evaluative sides. They have class 4 eyes, instrumental learning, they engage in wound tending. They also have some of the extras, a style of cognition that is suggestive of the phenomena discussed in workspace theories and the like. Not suggestive of there being a special place inside the animal, a workspace, but suggestive of the sort of attention-driven, novelty-directed way of being that workspace theorists associate with consciousness. Now, I think octopus smartness is sometimes exaggerated. They're not ruminative animals, but they have an exploratory style of behaviour, continually manipulating objects in novel ways. Their nervous systems are rather decentralised, with most neurons in the arms themselves, and that's relevant to questions about integration and the generation of a self, but they can often pull themselves together and act as attentive, evaluating subjects with rather chaotic mixes of curiosity and action. Try that again. I want to play a video. Okay, to finish, here is a video to show some of the complexity of what they get up to. The video was taken in special circumstances at Octopus, a site where densities are very high and octopuses have to deal with each other a lot more than usual. I like the video because it shows this sort of continual shifts of attention, different modes of behaviour. I like it also because we have another subject, a closer relative of us, present as well, a pufferfish observing the scene for its own mysterious reasons. It looks to me a little bit like a naturalist, and I have to admit it reminds me of David Attenborough. As the pufferfish watches, this octopus produces a display which we call the Nosferatu display, named after the movie Vampire of that name. This is a display which appears to signal aggressive intent, as it has spied two other octopuses coming into its area from outside. It zooms off towards them under jet propulsion, maintaining its dark colour, while they produce a characteristic paler colour that we find associated with less aggressive, more submissive behaviours. And then the octopus returns eventually to its den under the watchful eye of the naturalistic pufferfish. Now, one thing you might be wondering at this point is what happens if the pufferfish gets too close? I won't show video, I'll just show a couple of screenshots from a recent video of this. Peril for Sir David. One of the good parts of his story is that neither pufferfish nor octopus was harmed in the making of this video, but it is nonetheless a reminder of the risks attendant on close observation of complex animals.
Okay, so the way this works is the talks are all 20 minutes. We'll take 10 minutes for a Q&A after each talk, and then at the end of the session, we'll have some remaining time to get everyone on stage with some group discussion. But questions for Peter? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Peter. I wondered what you thought of the idea that maybe a more interesting question than which kinds of animals have consciousness here is actually what it's like to be these different animals, whether or not they're conscious or not.
I agree, it's an interesting question. In 20-odd minutes, it becomes a challenge, given that I wanted to cover the whole evolutionary story. But I think in the case of octopuses, I think you can start to imagine what it might be like to be an octopus. The sensory world of these animals is in some ways very familiar, in some ways very unfamiliar. They're very visual animals. They have an image-forming eye a lot like ours. But everything they touch with their arms is being tasted as well as touched in our sense. The body can form pretty much any shape at all. So it's a body that is, and probably forms various shapes without the central brain sort of supervising that much what the arms are doing. So you're in the world in a way that it involves a combination of rich and, probably not utterly alien visual information, but a very different way of being in contact with objects around you, which involves a kind of taste and this indefinite flexibility of the body. It also appears that octopuses may have some light sensitivity across all of their skin. Not that you could see with your skin, but there might be sort of washes of input from the play of higher and lower intensities of light on the skin. So I think when we say things like that, we're obviously saying things pretty quickly and speculatively, but it's not that there's something preventing us from making some steps forward and working out what it might be like to be this animal.
Thanks. Yeah, so one more over there.
Thank you. Excellent talk.
You have a paper on mind, matter, and metabolism, and I'm intrigued by Eric Cheson's work, where he calculates energy density flow, ergs per second per gram, as a rough measurement of complexity. And I'm just wondering, is there a corresponding increase in the metabolic rate of these species that exhibit subjectivity? Does the metabolism increase? Is it a cause or a consequence of the subjectivity that they experience?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd be cautious about readily believing in too direct a connection there. So if I take the case of crabs. So Robert Elwood's work suggests that crabs are evaluatively rich animals. They can make a sort of distinction between things going well or badly for themselves in a way that seems highly relevant to questions of subjective experience. Now, my understanding is that animals like crabs are not animals with a kind of rampant metabolism. They're rather low energy animals in a sort of general sense. Andrew might have more to say about this, or might know more about this than I do. But for reasons like that, I would not reject such an idea out of hand, but would treat it with a little bit of caution.
I was wondering if you think it's a necessary condition for an animal to have a central nervous system, to have a subjective experience. Because, for example, when we're thinking about some Nigerians or like scallops that can escape their predators, are we 100% sure that they cannot have a subjective experience?
Cases where you have a nervous system but not a central nervous system, I mean, that's exactly the place where, so I say some general things about the need to move to a more gradualist picture in this talk. And in some sorts of cases, I think, well, yes, that's a sort of very natural thing to do. When you raise animals that have a nervous system but with a great deal of decentralization, and I sort of feel the pressure of the case. And part of it, I think, is just the difficulty we have in thinking about in a genuinely gradualist way about questions like this. Thinking, is it the case, so for example, the most behaviorally complex animal with no centralization of the nervous system at all is probably the terrifying box jellyfish, which has pretty decent eyes, can navigate, and so on. So it acts like a sort of coherent animal agent for certain purposes, does have a nervous system. And I think there are no candidates that put pressure on the kind of picture I'm presenting that don't have a nervous system. But it's a case where the nervous system has no centralization. That's exactly the case where I probably should just say, I don't think we know how to think about cases like that very well yet. Because on the one hand, they have a kind of behavioral competence that's not too far from the sort that in other cases would suggest there's a very minimal kind of subjectivity present. On the architectural side, it looks a little weird to say that.
Okay, time for one more quick question. Maybe just pass the mic over to the back.
So we certainly do have to fight for the mic. I'm really interested in the case of wasps and spiders. So my understanding, for example, the cricket has efferent's copy, and they have complex sensors, and the spiders have complex mobile abilities, and yet they don't operantly condition, you said. So how do you explain the spiders and the wasps? Spiders build webs, for example. It's just puzzling to me that it seems to undermine the argument.
I'm glad wasps and spiders exist because they're the best cases of what seems to be a comprehensible separation between two subjectivity relevant features. So if you're a wasp, you have to fly, and flying is an incredibly demanding thing with respect to the sensory motor side. But if you're a wasp, you also have a life which is short, which is dominated by routine. There's a certain number of behaviors you have to get through. There's not much openness. There's not much capacity to sort of do something different from the other wasps and do so successfully if you're a wasp. So given that you have natural selection miniaturizing the brain, I think it makes a certain amount of sense that what you would end up with is an animal that has a rich sensory motor capacity. The presentation of objects may have things like perceptual constancies, which people like Burge think are very important to genuine representation, and that might in turn be taken as relevant to a certain kind of subjectivity. But there's just no reason to have evaluative sophistication because your life is so short and so routinized. Crabs have much longer lives than animals like wasps. Marine arthropods tend to live longer and have less of a kind of, I've got to get this done by 5 o'clock tomorrow or I'm dead, in the way that a wasp life tends to have. So I think of this as a kind of probably the best case for showing the possible separability of properties that each are subjectivity relevant, which in us are present together, but which might be dissociated in some cases.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Okay, our next speaker is Todd Feinberg. Todd is actually a psychiatrist by training in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurology at Mount Sinai, who's written a number of books over the years about consciousness in humans and the self, really interesting books, but has also had an abiding interest in the evolution of consciousness, to the point where recently he co-authored a book with John Nowak on the ancient origins of consciousness, all about the evolution of consciousness that's really had quite a degree of uptake and influence. So today, Todd will talk to us about the ancient evolutionary origins of consciousness. Please welcome Todd Feinberg.
So I arrived here yesterday from Beth Israel, and I decided to relax, watch some television. First thing I put on, Planet of the Apes. And it was the bad ape that was on. Okay, so I didn't know if that was a omen, good or bad, but nonetheless, at least it wasn't SpongeBob SquarePants. How did I get to this podium today? My career has been mainly involved with the study of humans, human consciousness, perturbations of the self in patients with brain lesions, stroke, traumatic brain injury, callosal lesions, alien hand syndrome. But all throughout, I've been fascinated by the question of subjectivity and consciousness and where does it come from. Read a huge amount of philosophy on this, trying to figure out the origins of subjectivity. I was always interested in brain evolution, trying to drill down how far back can we go in the complexity of a brain to create what we call subjectivity. Now, subjectivity, even though it is related to consciousness, the two are used not identically. In my opinion, as I agree with Peter, that subjectivity is the real challenge. So, pushing back, I got down to an organism known as Amphioxus, which is a lancelet, and I said, is this little guy conscious or not? Would I ascribe subjectivity to this animal? Looked at its nervous system, started to work on the transition from Amphioxus and beyond, and we believe, John and I, and then I teamed up with John Nowak, who's an evolutionary biologist, and looked at that transition between that animal and, for example, something like a lamprey eel as the transitional form where we could say with good likelihood that that animal is conscious, whereas the other isn't. With the goal being, if we could identify the neurobiological factors that accounted for that transition, we would find the basis of subjectivity. That, overall, is the thrust of what this project is about. This slide is perhaps, in certain respects, the most important slide. Because what we're trying to indicate here is that in order to address this problem, we need to look at it from multiple perspectives. If you want to decide what is it like to be a bat, or is there something it's like to be a bat, you must read the philosophy to understand what that question entails. Yet at the same time, it must be informed by the neurobiology of nervous systems, the evolutionary aspects of how consciousness or subjectivity came into being, and using extant animals as proxies for this evolutionary development, as well as to understanding the underlying neurobiology and behavior. The goal was to integrate, synthesize these factors to emerge with a unification or a synthetic theory that could account for all of these aspects. Okay, as we just saw, how do we decide what animals are conscious or what animals have subjectivity? Whether it's their subjectivity or our subjectivity, there's no question a fish does not have the same subjectivity as a chimp. I don't think anybody would make that argument. I don't think chimps have the same subjectivity as we do. Certainly, we don't have the same subjectivity as a fish. That does not disqualify a fish or a lamprey eel from having subjectivity. It depends upon your criteria and what you mean by it. Okay, now the most basic forms of experience, our targets are, let me get my glasses on here. This goes by various names. Perceptual consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, primary consciousness, sensory consciousness, they all are pretty much the same idea, with the emphasis in our work on the sensory aspects of it, or the perception. This is the aspect of consciousness that's most related to what Nagel called something it is like to be, which we've already heard about. Now, this is a point in which you see the intersection between the philosophy and the biology. Levine, in a classic paper, spoke about the explanatory gap between the objective brain and subjective experience. And that gap is what we have since the time of Descartes, trying to close, or at least bridge, or at least explain. But this is critical to determining what animals have subjective experience. Because if an animal's got that gap, at least according to my view, if the animal has that gap, it's got subjective experience. That's the way I look at it. Now, John Searle spoke about subjective awareness as being ontologically subjective, in other words, irreducibly, ontologically personal to the animal, to the being. This I agree with, and I will try to explain in the end how this works. Finally, David spoke about the hard problem of consciousness, in which explaining subjective experience, I think you would agree, is critical or central to the whole project. Well, things always got a little more complicated the deeper you look into them. And it turns out that there are at least 4 gaps between subjective experience, or the first-person experience, and the third-person viewer. One is referral. This applies mainly to exteroceptive awareness, awareness of the world, whereas mental images or mental representations are referred or projected into the environment. Sherrington called that projitions. Unity, binding. Experience tends to be unified, not totally, tends to be unified, certainly more unified than observation of the visible individual neurons in the brain. Causation. How can one's subjective experience, if it's not material, affect the world, affect things outside of it? Qualia. Now, qualia is king. qualia, when you get right down to it, if you can explain sensory experience and how things feel, why things have feeling, how can objective material neurons produce experience and feeling, if you understood that, you're basically game over. Okay, now, again, things get a little more complicated. It turns out that qualitative experience has a diversity of neurobiological bases. It's not just one thing, which is a dumbfounding kind of problem. Because basically in neurology, we're used to the brain having a particular etiology for a particular problem. Okay? If you want to know how epilepsy happens, we have an answer. When it comes to subjectivity, it turns out that there's a diversity of material or neurobiological bases across, within even individual brains. So when you're talking about cross-species differences, right away, that octopus, I can tell you, if you look at that brain, it is so different than what we see in a human or in a primate or a vertebrate. However, what we will see, I hope to show, although I won't go into it in that much detail on the cephalopods, is that there are some common factors that can account for or play a role in creating subjectivity both across species and within brains. Okay. Exteroceptive sensory consciousness, awareness of the world. This is often taken to be the prototypical form of awareness. Okay. Christoph Koch, Tononi, Francis Crick and Koch focused exclusively on this. Gerald Edelman was mainly interested in the perception and sensory experiences of the world and how that translates from the brain to consciousness. Affective consciousness is called sentience. Those are global emotional states. This is the domain of Tony Damasio, Joe Ledoux, I don't know if Joe is here, Jaak Panskep. Interestingly enough, that is also sometimes taken as the prototypical form of consciousness. But believe me, these two are very different, but they both have qualia. Interoceptive consciousness. Here's another aspect, which is these are internal drives based upon internal motivated states, and this includes pain, which we're going to be hearing a lot about later on in this conference. Pain is sometimes taken as a prototypical form of consciousness, but its neurobiology is very different from, say, the redness of the apple or the smell of the coffee. Everyone's got their favorite qualia. I love when I read these because everyone's got coffee. Coffee seems to be like the number one qualia for some reason. The taste of coffee in my mouth. I mean, I don't know why that is said so many times, but it happens all the time. And the redness of red. That's another good one. All types of qualia and the explanatory gaps all have subjectivity. So these, even though they have diverse neurobiologies, they all have qualia in common. As I said, they are diverse both within, their neurobiology is diverse both within and across species. Okay, we take a multidisciplinary approach, as I showed you on our first slide, and our primary targets are exteroceptive sensory images and affects. We use a comparative neurobiological approach that looks at these within brains, so within an individual brain, what's happening when I see versus when I feel. And we look at it as well by behavioral criteria. What can the animal do? How does the animal respond? How would we infer subjectivity in the animal's brain? Okay, let's take first a look at exteroceptive sensory consciousness. This is awareness of the environment, touch, vision, audition, smell. They are referred. In other words, you don't feel a visual stimulus on your retina. You don't go, it's out there, okay? As a matter of fact, you cannot feel red on your retina, or you cannot feel red in your brain. You can only feel it as a projective sense. These involve various types of sensory maps. They go by various names. Vision is visuotopic. Your sense of touch is somatotopic, but there are also chemosenses like olfaction and gustation that create what we call isomorphic maps. And Butler calls them isomorphic maps. So they're mapped. They have some features in common with somatotopic maps, but they're not strictly mapped in terms of the environment. Somatotopic is mapped on your body. Visuotopic is mapped in the visual world. Okay, so the classic ones, for example, are isomorphic sensory. So somatotopic is the classic sort of one everybody knows about, where you have a homunculus in your brain that has a map representation of the spatial aspects of your body. It's projected onto that surface, and then it's experienced as a map. So that's very classically a somatotopic. Visuotopic is the same way. Okay? You can see it very clearly in the star-nosed mole, where he's got these, what do they call those, tentacles or appendages, and they map, each one of those has a little space in the mole's brain representing each one of those tentacles. So that's a somatotopic map. When we looked at this, what we found, it was almost like, and then there was a miracle. You know that cartoon where the guy's got all the things that says, and then a miracle happens, okay? But this truly is an amazing part of the story of the vertebrate brain and the development of sensory consciousness and subjectivity. These are called the neural crest and placodes, okay? They're embryonic cells that arose at the dawn of the vertebrates and occur in full development only in the vertebrates. They contribute to regions of the head and neck for sensory experience, and they contribute as well to the somatic senses of touch, pain, and temperature. Okay? The ectodermal placodes, so again, these are embryological. They occur mainly in vertebrates in full form, and they occur during a period of time that we think is probably around the Cambrian. These are involved with the lens of the eye, receptor cells of the nose, and hearing, the ear for hearing. So in other words, all of your basic senses are dependent upon the development of these neurobiological, evolutionary, embryological developments. And the lens of the eye is critical for forming, if we talk about vision, critical for forming the image-forming eye. Okay, if you could explain the image-forming eye, all right, if you have a representation that is in your brain, that is not experienced on the retina, is projected in the world, and the animal has a subjective experience that diverges between the first and third person representation, that is an example of subjectivity. Compared to what? Oh my God. That can't be, I didn't start till oh my God, okay. Okay, here is your neural, I started late, by the way, but anyway, okay. And everybody here knows it, I have a lot of witnesses. Okay. Okay, very quickly then. So then, these are the placodes, and they contribute to the lens of the eye, the smell, hearing, critical for the development of what is going to be sensory consciousness. You can see what happens here. This is a lancelet, an amphioxus. The very primitive brain, a single frontal eye, a grossly, Thurston Lecali does beautiful work on this that shows that there is a pre-substrate for these things, but very, very crude. This animal is unlikely, or really we don't believe it has consciousness. Look what happens, though, with the advent of the neurocrest and placodes around the time of that craving, and here you get, in a very complex brain, you've got smell in the telencephalon. You've got, we believe, in the optic tectum is where, in the midbrain, where vision is occurring, in combination with some hindbrain. And you've got a well-differentiated tripartite brain of a telencephalon, midbrain, hindbrain. This is a revolution in consciousness. This is a revolution. And this is where we think the explanatory gaps start, and this is where we think the hard problem starts. If I say that enough, will you give me a little more time or no? No? No. All right, I'm not working. This is not working. Okay. I want to read you this one part here, is that this is from Lamb's work on, beautiful work on the retina and vision, and he says that it was not until the Cambrian, beginning around 540, the animal begins to evolve image-forming eyes. So there, is virtual, I think, almost proof that there's some aspect of subjectivity that evolved in the Cambrian. Okay? The theory is that sensory images began at this time, and that would be for touch, for vision, for smell, for hearing, where all of these exteroceptive sensory functions came into being, and it would be with an animal, fish-like animal called Hecauxus. And therefore, the extant living representative of that is the lamprey eel. Every time I look at a lamprey on television, I go, God, look at that. Isn't that amazing, that little guy? Okay, so now we see that here is the branch point where you get an animal like Hecauxus, Hecula more primitive, and eventually something like a lamprey eel. Isn't that adorable? That's Hecauxus. That may be the first conscious vertebrate on Earth. At least when I look at it, that's what I think. That guy, you did it, man. Okay, I'm going to run through affect very quickly since I only have 0.1 minutes. Again, something it's like to be. Difficult to find absolute criteria. We're never going to find absolute criteria. This is always going to be an argument to debate. It's always going to be debatable. It's going to be somewhat subjective. There's always to be a consensus. They'll never find an absolute criteria for this. And it is likely to be in a continuum, but there are some markers, okay? These are the origins of affective consciousness that we use as a comparative neuroanatomy. These are the usual suspects that are involved in various aspects of emotion. I won't go into these all, but we found the following, that these structures are absent in cephalochordates like Amphioxus. They don't have them. But bony fish have 23 of 25, and lampreys have 19 of 25. Good argument for affective awareness in a fish or a lamprey. For the behavioral criteria, we looked at these. We're going to hear more about these later on. Learning global, non-reflexive operant responses, behavioral trade-offs, such as cost-benefit decisions, frustration behavior, self-delivery of analgesics. We found all vertebrates show evidence of all these behaviors. The cephalochordates do not. Amphioxus do not. So now you can see the picture coming together. You've got an animal with a primitive brain who doesn't. You've got an animal with a relatively short evolutionary span has these behaviors that does. So this is our basic model. This is where it all happens. We believe in the vertebrate line with the origins of affective, interoceptive, and exteroceptive consciousness. And as we agree with everyone at this meeting that we give it to the octopus, we give it to some arthropods, probably many of them, and we give it to vertebrates. I want to finish with the following. So what does all this mean? I started out doing this work to try to find the origins of subjectivity. This is our scheme. We believe that many, many years ago, at the origins of life, so we're talking back in 3.75 billion years ago, life created some functional aspects that include embodiment, process. Consciousness is a process. It's not a thing. System, self-organization, and biological hierarchies. Not conscious, but laying down the foundations for consciousness. Then we went through a period of millions of years where we got increased rates and connectivity at the level of reflexes. Non-conscious, but once again, walking the road, walking the path. Okay? Increased neuronal specializations. Neurons began to do different things. Okay? And simple reflex arcs become chains of complexity-connected neurons. Finally, this is the dawn of consciousness right here. Even though these are critical, and I would not exclude these, and indeed, I don't think we get these without these, which is a critical part of understanding subjectivity, and the hard problem is that we must not exclude these. If we're going to get to the bottom of subjectivity, you must have these involved in your theory. Okay, finally, conscious animals have brains that appear to be at least 100,000 neurons. They're hierarchically arranged in unique neural-neural interactions. They create either mental images or isomorphic mental images. They create affective networks rather than isomorphic coding, and they have intention. Let me just finish with the following. I'm beginning to not like this. Okay, let me add this, because this is something that is underappreciated. We just spoke about the unique origins of subjectivity in evolution and in animals. But something else happens. Once that starts happening, the subject and objective perspectives begin to diverge. What do I mean by that? Very briefly, the neuron, the subject, has no access to their own neurons. I can't see my own brain. I can only see the world, I can feel myself, but I can't see my own neurons. At the same time, the outside observer can see the neurons, but he has no access to the subjective experience of the individual. So this is sort of, when you go the other way and start building up subjectivity, all of a sudden you end up with this conundrum, the mind-body problem, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, here's our final slide, or almost final slide, penultimate. I can't believe how short this was. Penultimate, okay? I put a lot of work into this. Okay, so 3.75 billion years ago, life, don't forget it. Any theory that's going to get you up here, you got to start down here, the foundation. Everything involved with consciousness has in common life. All right, this is for animal consciousness. Whether there'll ever be anything like that Westworld show, I have no idea. But I doubt it. I don't think it's possible. Next, you get reflexes. Then you add on neurohierarchical complexity, 560 to 520 million years ago. We call these the special features. That's where consciousness is born and built upon these. You get resulting images and affects. These give you your 4 gaps. You add on the problem of auto and allo irreducibility, the ability to see your own neurons, etc. There you go. That gets you home without any gaps. Conclusions. By our criteria, consciousness across species, vertebrates, arthropods, and cephalopods, appears to have emerged via different, this was touched on earlier, we think it's clear there are different neurobiological mechanisms. It's diverse across species and individual brains, thus making a single neurobiological explanation unlikely, if not impossible. So when I read a paper, then the person says, that's it. That. I don't buy into it. I don't believe there is such a thing that translates any single factor of neurons into subjectivity. When you build in life and reflexes, you get to these special features, but these may vary, and do vary, across species and within brains. But there are a number of common factors. And the explanation for consciousness and ontological subjectivity overlap, but they're not identical. If you're looking for subjectivity in a neuron, you're not going to find it. Thank you.
Okay, Todd is still working on his best-selling next book on consciousness of time. Got some valuable data here. Okay, we got time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Okay, Tyler. There you go.
So you started off with this distinction that there's a distinction between subjectivity and consciousness. And yet I never really got it. Because, I mean, during your talk, at times it was subjectivity is equivalent to primary or sensory consciousness, and at the end you had a slide, subjectivity and consciousness are ... but they don't overlap totally. So I really didn't get I didn't get a distinction there.
Okay, look, it's very, that's a topic, that's a whole other hour, but basically, yes.
That was your talk.
Everybody talks about consciousness, but are they really talking about subjectivity? Consciousness involves awakeness and alertness and all these other variables. That's not subjectivity. If a person is unconscious, Okay, that gets down to their brain stem and core brain functions and awakeness and sleep, and that's consciousness. Subjectivity is the hard problem. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, okay? Consciousness is about subjectivity. The hard problem or the explanatory gaps are really about subjectivity. Consciousness is just a much broader term. Subjectivity is sort of a sub-part of that problem, but I think the most interesting.
Thank you. You talk about the origins of life, and I can't help but ask the question of the transitions. So if you have maybe autocatalytic sets at the very origins of life, where life was chemistry, had in a very limited basic way the same properties of that referral, etc., that you were referring to, would you agree that if starting from there, you would have transitions to more complex kind of the consciousness you're describing?
No. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you're saying, but we take life as a resolvable and resolved problem. We're not interested in the origins of life, if that's what you're asking. And everything, all the animals we spoke about start with the same life, we presume, unless you believe that cephalopods came from Mars and, vertebrates came from a meteor from Jupiter, So we take life as a given, and that we take universal principles as life as a solved problem. I'm not sure that answers you, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, we should move on now. So thank you, Todd. Okay, our next speaker is Andrew Barron from Macquarie University in Sydney. You might have noticed that Australians are very well represented in this session, and indeed at the conference. No bias on the part of the organisers, I assure you. But Andrew's in the Department of Biological Sciences at Macquarie. He's done a lot of work on neuroscience, especially in insects, especially in bees. Been a specialist in bee cognition and behavior, and has recently gotten very interested in questions of consciousness. Published a very influential paper with the philosopher Colin Klein last year, making a case for consciousness in insects. His paper today is Insects Have the Capacity for Basic Awareness. So please welcome Andrew.
Okay, thank you. If I speak at that volume, you can hear me at the back? It's all right? No. If I speak at that volume, you can hear me. If I do that, is that better? Okay, that's much better. Okay. All right, thank you for inviting me to speak today. David talked about how some of us have come from philosophy to animal behavior, some from animal behavior to philosophy. I'm definitely one of those, coming from animal behavior to philosophy. I'm a comparative neuroscientist. Most of my research is on organisms like the honeybee. And then last year I teamed up with my colleague Colin Klein, and we were really thinking about what we could infer from what we're learning about insect neuroscience and what that might mean for what we could conclude about awareness in things like a bee. So what I want to do today is to summarize the arguments that Colin and I put forward and update them with some new information that we have. And the talk's really in two parts. The first part is my perspective on how the insect brain works. The second part is what I think the consequences of that might be for our thinking about consciousness and awareness in organisms like insects. Okay, that's a slide I use a lot in talks that I give. This is basically a laundry list of clever things it's been claimed that bees can do. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with everything on this list, but what I want to emphasize is that insects are not just instinctive, behaviorally fixed, innate-driven organisms. Some insects, at least, have levels of behavioral complexity that rival those of some mammals. That's despite them having a brain that is a fraction of the size of even the smallest mammals. So that's a honeybee brain. That scale bar is 1 millimeter, so we have a millimetrically scaled brain. This is a very big brain for an insect, but it's still got less than 1 million neurons. But what I want you to realize from this slide is that look at the level of internal structural complexity in this insect brain. There's a lot of different specialized modules operating together, integrated together as a highly complex structure. So the insect brain is small, but the insect brain is definitely not simple. My research has been thinking about how the insect brain might work as a system. And a lot of my thinking in that area has been influenced by the work of Bjorn Merker, who I think gave us a really instructive conceptual model of how any autonomous behavioral system would have to operate. So Bjorn kind of laid out that if you're going to be an autonomous behaving entity, in real time you need to resolve 3 interacting domains of decision making. You need to resolve what you need, what's out there in the world that you can get, and what you've got to do to get it. And those domains are not separate, they have to interact because what's available feeds back into what you need, and also the distribution of where things are influences what you've got to do to get it. And what Bjorn emphasized is that the capacity to resolve those 3 interacting domains of decision-making localized to the structures of the vertebrate midbrain and diencephalon, not the cortex. So it's the older, more primitive parts of the vertebrate brain that Todd just talked about that give us the capacity to resolve this kind of a problem. And also in Bjorn's integrated, what he called a behavioral core control system, he emphasized the role of the tectum, which is another region that Todd talked about, as being a super hub in that network, because the tectum is an anatomical locus where the representation of space, including where the animal is located in space, has a capacity to interact with the state and the needs of the organism within the tectum. Okay, and Bjorn spoke about this system having a capacity to create a reality space, which is basically a model of the organism, a neural model of the organism in its world. And that reality space is itself the mechanism for resolving autonomous behavioral control. It's not a Cartesian theater. It itself is the mechanism that allows you to operate autonomously in your environment. And in Todd's work, Todd highlighted how this kind of autonomous organized behavior is extremely ancient in the vertebrate line. These structures we talked about of the midbrain and diencephalon go right back to the basal vertebrates. So we're looking at a behavioral control system that is at least basal to the vertebrate line. What I was thinking about was how we could possibly apply that kind of thinking to an understanding of the insect brain. So Colin and I, we were inspired by Bjorn's model. We took that model and we asked how might this apply to a brain that is radically different than the brain of an insect. I don't want to go into too much detail about the specifics of what we proposed, but what we argued is that the totality of the insect brain is functionally analogous to what's going on with the vertebrate midbrain and diencephalon, and that we can think about the insect brain as doing exactly the same job of resolving these same 3 interacting domains of decision-making. And to summarize it, we imagine that the insect brain as a whole creates this functional representation of the state of the mobile animal in space, and that that's a solution for effective decision-making in insects. And what we did here is we color-coded, it's very much simplified, we color-coded the different key regions of the insect brain, how they might contribute to different elements that make up this reality space as it applies to the insect. Now, the neuroscience of our argument was critiqued on really 2 grounds. First of all, what did we mean by represent in something like an insect brain? And then, how did we know the insect brain is actually integrated? So I just want to quickly cover those 2 critiques. Our use of the term represent is actually quite a lightweight use of the term represent. It's very much reconcilable with how Andy Clark's been thinking about how nervous systems can represent information. We're thinking about represent in a connectivist viewpoint, that it's basically connections and connection weights that is our representation. We're not imagining an offline stored non-dynamic representation at all. It's very much an active representation as part of the system. So we think we are reconcilable with Andy Clark's perspective on representation and reconcilable with Barbara Webb's critique of what representation could be in a nervous system. I think the more nuanced, well, certainly the more challenging critique, though I actually wasn't quite expecting, was, is the insect brain actually integrated? And where this came from is that for a lot of people, they've had a lot of success in modeling insect behavior with explicitly non-integrated models, subsumption models, where there's explicitly no integration of the system. What I'm really pleased to say now is that we are right at the cusp of comparative neuroscience and invertebrate neuroscience moving into a connectomic level of understanding. So we have the first drafts of the first insect connectome, and the Drosophila connectome. And that's letting us answer categorically whether the insect brain is an integrated system or non-integrated system. And what's fantastic is that what's come out from this first draft of a Drosophila connectome is this diagram of information flows through the Drosophila brain, so not a bee, it's a fruit fly, 10 times smaller than a bee, but at least in terms of modules and regions, it's similar enough that we can assume information should transfer to a degree. But at least in the fruit fly, this is a model of how information flows through the fly brain to generate action. And what I want to emphasize is this is a completely integrated system. So we have the lines of sensory processing in blue, all of which feed into these two iterative and interacting premotor loop and in green and the motor loop in black. So we have a fully integrated system that is generating action commands. And if we got into the specifics and the detail and related what these regions were doing, we could actually consider exactly this model in terms of resolving the domains of the motivation of the organism, what's available in space, and what the organism needs to do to get it. So it is fair to say that the insect brain operates as an integrated structure. Now, what's also neat about this brand new connectomic data that's coming out is that in Todd's, jet lagged. In Bjorn's model of the vertebrate behavioral core control system, Bjorn emphasized the tectum as a superhub in that behavioral control system. What comes out from the Drosophila connectome is the superhub is the fan-shaped body, which is a region of the central complex. And that is the fan-shaped body here in a locust. Here's the fan-shaped body in a fruit fly. We're very literal in the insect world. It's called the fan-shaped body because it's a body that looks like a fan. What's neat about the fan-shaped body, one of the reasons I like it is absolutely bang in the anatomical center of the insect brain. We've also got reasons to believe this is probably the oldest part of the arthropod brain, and that the fan-shaped body is very highly conserved, not just within insects, but also within spiders and within crustaceans. Now, the fan-shaped body is a region that we're learning a lot about right now. And what we're learning is that it is that the functional analogy between the fan-shaped body and the tectum is really quite profound. So across the neural populations in the fan-shaped body, there is a representation of space. It does represent the position of the organism within space. It represents the location of relevant objects relative to the organism in space. And as a neurochemist, I'm excited because this is the most neuromodulated region of the insect brain. And what this suite of neuromodulators does is it changes the way in which objects are represented relative to the organism and puts a subjective weight on them according to the needs of the organism. And that neuromodulation also supports a window of selective attention, which allows the organism to place within that window the objects that it particularly needs to pay attention to or needs to orient towards. Now, we're also realizing that this feature of subjective selective attention is a really widespread feature of the insect brain. This work is really being driven by Bruno van Swinderen, who's a colleague of mine at University of Queensland. And really, wherever we look in the higher processing regions of the insect brain, we see this phenomenon of selective attention. And the reason I raise this is the insect brain is much more than the simple sensorimotor transformation system. The processing within the insect brain is itself subjective, depending on the state of the organism and what the organism is paying attention to. Okay, so what I've done is I've described my view on how the insect brain works as a behavioral control system that allows an organism like a bee to operate as a cognitive affective agent. But what's relevant to this meeting is have I just described a mechanism, or do we have any bounds or any reason to imagine there is any level of awareness in an organism like a bee? So that's really what I want to try to get into here. And the nature of the argument I want to make really boils down to this. So Bjorn and others have argued that structures in the midbrain and the diencephalon, they don't just support this behavioral control capacity. They are also important for our basic awareness of the world. And we know that because if we interfere with the structures of the midbrain and diencephalon, we don't just interfere with behavioral control, we also interfere with our awareness and our subjective experience of the world. So there is a relationship there. We may not know the exact details of what that relationship is, but the relationship exists. And for that reason, other organisms that share this sort of behavioral control system, share this sort of brain, share this way of processing the world, we're to greater and lesser degrees reasonably comfortable with extending not just this model of behavioral control to them, but also this basic, an assumption that it might be reasonable to infer a basic capacity of awareness for organisms that have this sort of a brain. Now, what's also important for my argument is that myself and others, not everyone, believe that there are different levels to consciousness and that it is possible to have a basic form of awareness, this is something that Peter talked about, without having to also invoke the necessity for self-awareness or meta-self-awareness. So I feel that it is possible to be basically aware of things without the requirement to be self-aware. And for that reason, what we're talking about is how far could we extend, how far could we reach this capacity for basic awareness down a phylogenetic tree of organisms that have a similar sort of brain, but we're not having to invoke a capacity for self-awareness in order to have that basic capacity for awareness. Now, some authors are, like Thomas Nagel, who's staring at me in the front row, which is really, really nerve-wracking, would be quite happy to extend this capacity for basic awareness quite a long way down the mammalian line. So in Thomas's extremely influential and highly cited paper, Thomas is quite comfortable to think of the bat as an experiential entity. It has some sort of experience, it has some sort of awareness. That's not the question phrased in the paper. The question is actually phrased, what sort of awareness does the bat have? Not, is the bat an aware organism? And Thomas was happy to extend that capacity for awareness to a bat because the bat's a mammal like we are and probably processes the world in a way that's pretty similar to the way that other mammals process the world. So we could be reasonably comfortable to imagining that capacity for awareness should extend to something like a bat. Now, if you're happy to extend awareness to a bat, the question becomes, would you also be happy to extend awareness to something like a bee? So we can make an argument for homology of brain systems and anatomical similarity of brain systems if we're extending awareness to something like a bat, because there is a very, very strong homology, there's a very strong conservation of brain structures across mammals. The problem when we move beyond the vertebrate line is we do not have that homology, we don't have that anatomical similarity to rely on. But what I would argue is that what we see in the brain of something like a bee is we see an extremely strong and clear functional analogy between what the vertebrate brain is doing, what the mammalian brain is doing, and what the bee brain is doing in terms of creating this reality space, allowing the bee to operate as a cognitive affective agent. So the question is it reasonable on the basis of that functional analogy to extend not just this capacity for behavioral control, but also a capacity for basic awareness? And I would argue that it probably is reasonable to extend a capacity for basic awareness as far as something like to a bee. It doesn't seem reasonable to me to imagine that it can only be the anatomical specificity of a vertebrate brain that supports awareness, when other systems that do the same job as a vertebrate brain, why would they also not support a capacity for awareness? Does that therefore mean that I think that everything is aware? And this is where, unlike the other two speakers, I'm actually probably a bit more comfortable in drawing some sort of a line. So I would say that no. I think only systems that generate this reality space construct have a capacity to support a meaningful version of awareness and a subjective character to experience. I wouldn't go so far as needing to extend that to something like the nematode C. elegans. And given the question earlier, I wouldn't go so far as to extend it to something like a box jellyfish. Now, that's not to say that the C. elegans doesn't have a nervous system. It has a nervous system. It's centralized. It's integrated. There is interaction of sensory information in the nematode nervous system. But what's lacking is there is no capacity for the nematode to relate its senses. And there is really no capacity for much subjective processing in the nematode. So the nematode has no spatial sense, no temporal sense. Without that binding, unifying relation between sensory information, I think it's really hard for the nematode to create any sort of unified percept. I don't think a nematode can support either a meaningful version of experience, nor can it actually be in any sense a meaningful subject. And with lacking both of those, I think it's a moot point to ask whether there's any subjective aspect to a nematode's experience, given I don't think it has the capacity to support experience. So I'm going to wrap up there. To summarize my argument, what I've done is I've proposed a model of how the insect brain works as a behavioral control system. It does that by creating a reality space for the bee that basically is a neural model of the mobile bee in space, weighted by the needs and subjective state of the bee. I think that's a really close functional analogy between the kinds of processing that are happening certainly in primitive vertebrates. And for that reason, I think it is a reasonable argument to propose that we could extend a basic assumption of awareness to organisms like a bee. And thanks very much.
Okay, we have a bit of time for questions.
So I'm just interested. Thank you for a really beautiful presentation. I'm really interested in something you said at the end about this necessary condition of unified subjectivity, and I really wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. It seems that that's a condition that you haven't, that you just sort of threw in, and it seems that if that's what's necessary, I think more argument is needed. So I wonder if you could say more about that.
So what I meant by that is I think that this sense of perceptual unity is such a strong part of our experiential world that if you're lacking that, whether there can be any meaningful subjectivity to senses in isolation is a question that I'm struggling with. I think it's when senses fall into relation with each other that's when we get this sense of a unified percept, and I think that that's when it's moot to talk about basically being a subject and to also have a subjective character to the experience. And so I was reaching for a water bottle. I can't see you ask the question, so I'm sort of flapping my eye gaze across the room in a really vague way. Ah, there you are. Thank you. Good. Hello. Sorry. Yep.
So you gave a list of your criteria for bees. So the thing that I wonder about your talk, actually the previous two talks as well, is that for many of those things, we know that humans can do them unconsciously. For example, we have unconscious attention. We have unconscious multisensory integration. So I wonder, in fact, I believe probably it's true for every single thing on your list that they can be done unconsciously. So how can we conclude from those items that insects are conscious?
So let me clarify, that's not my list of criteria for consciousness in insects. That list included purely to break the myth that an insect is an instinct-driven organism with no behavioral capacity. And I put that list up there because within my lifetime as a researcher, it's still very much the case. I go to conferences and people ask me the question, does a bee have a brain? People are still driven by textbooks saying that insects cannot learn. Whereas what we're learning is actually a great deal about the behavioral capacity of an organism. So no, I don't think any of those are necessary or requirements for consciousness in insects. They simply illustrate the behavioral capacities of the organism that we're dealing with.
You didn't really answer the main question.
No, but I did clarify a point. But
you did. But the main question is, if we're...
I am. Trying.
The main question...
Quickly. Yeah, go on.
The main question is, if we're going to find characteristics of insects that we think may be sufficient for them to have consciousness, there's a big problem if those can be done unconsciously in humans.
So I'm now going to answer your question, Ned. I'm going to try to. So I think that what we're looking at is actually a point that has been raised by the two previous speakers, which is the different levels of consciousness. So we can talk about, when we talk about a human being unconscious, we're talking about basically lesioning a degree of self-awareness, but have we actually lesioned the awareness of the human in order for them to carry out the kind of things on that list? The only level of consciousness that I'm dragging down to an insect is a basic awareness of its environment rather than no awareness at all.
I think we're all like the drunk and the lamppost.
Myself included, I thought I stood up quite well.
Myself included.
Okay.
We're looking for the origin of X. And we use all these weasel words for X, like subjectivity, experience, consciousness, awareness, self-awareness, agency, qualia. We add functional criteria like integration, etc. It allows us to deny that an amphioxus is conscious because we've used another word for consciousness. Even Tom Nagel, in his very catchy title, left out what would have prevented all this weaseling. Instead of calling his article, "What is it like to be a bat?" if he had said, "What does it feel like to be a bat?" we'd know what it is that we were shooting for. And what we're denying Amphioxus, if we pinch him and all he feels is ouch and either runs or stays, and yet he feels it. That's the problem, explaining that. The rest is just picking our favorite correlate for the presence of that.
So I'm not clear what the question is.
Why do we need integration rather than just ouch?
So you're saying the only thing that would matter would be an aversive response to pain?
The only thing that matters for consciousness is sentience, and sentience is feeling something, anything.
But haven't you just contradicted yourself? Because if what you're feeling is not ouch, are you still sentient?
If you're feeling something, you're sentient. If you're feeling nothing, you're not sentient.
So integrating the model that I put forward and that Bjorn proposed, exactly integrated in that is this, I mean, we talk about it in terms of motivation, needs of the organism, but it's that subjective state of self. So that's certainly part of the argument that I've proposed. We'll disagree on whether it's a weasel word or useful or not.
Okay, one more from up here.
So you've pushed back against the idea that insects are little robots that have rigid behavior. But there are, I mean, obviously there are many kinds of insects. And I'm wondering where you apply this. And as a fellow Australian, I'm concerned about ants, as you would understand. I've been told, for example, that in some species of ant, when an ant dies, the workers remove the body from the hive or the colony. But in fact, if you put a drop of oleic acid, I think it is, on the body of a living ant, the worker ants will drag it out as if it were dead, even though it's wriggling and resisting. That doesn't sound to me like they have much awareness. That sounds more like you've got an algorithm that hasn't quite got all the subtlety that it should have.
Okay, so that's a bit of an, that's a slight, okay, so the complex, so first of all, that's a bit of an unfair stereotype of a lot of ants.
Good,
and
I'll accept that.
I'm very fond of a lot of ants and have deep personal relationships with a lot of ants. But the more nuanced answer is that what we developed in detail in the paper that Colin and I put forward is the distinction between content and capacity. So I'm talking about a capacity for any sort of awareness at all. The content, the kind of awareness will vary enormously between species depending on what their sensory systems are and the kind of world they live in and their niche and their structures. For the ants that you're talking about, for the ones where that will work, which is a minority of ants who are a bit dumb, then we're talking about the ants that are extremely olfactory driven with almost no sense of vision. And in those situations, yes, they will be overwhelmingly driven by an olfactory pheromone like that. It actually is adaptive for anything that even smells a bit dead to get rid of it because of the danger of infecting the colony. So if you're unsure, assume it's dead from an ant's point of view and get it out the hive. Nest, ant, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, our final speaker is Eva Jablonka from Tel Aviv University. Eva is a theoretical biologist who's appointed in the Cohn Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Ideas in Tel Aviv. Very well known for her work on a broad scope model of evolutionary theory. The book Evolution in Four Dimensions has been especially influential. In recent years, he's gotten very interested in consciousness, and the talk today will be on consciousness as we know it, the role of learning. So please welcome Eva Jablonka.
Thank you very much, and really thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to present a slightly different perspective on consciousness, which is basically an evolutionary perspective, an evolutionary transition perspective. Not just based on comparative studies, also on comparative studies, but on a general, broad concept of what an evolutionary, of major evolutionary transition of the kind of the transition to consciousness may mean and how we could study it. So first of all, I want to make clear what I'm talking about and what are the concepts that I'm using. So I'm going to talk about minimal consciousness, and this for me is the same as sentience, and this is the same as subjective experiencing. This is the most basic, non-reflective, subjective feeling that includes exteroceptive, visual, olfactory, interoceptive, pain, hunger, thirst, and proprioceptive, bodily position, for example, experiences. And what we suggest, and when I'm saying we, I'm talking about this work has not only been done by myself, it's done with Simona Ginsburg and Zohar Bronfman, with whom we've been working for quite a long time. And our basic view, our basic concept of of how we should look at consciousness is we look at it as a dynamical, intrinsically teleological system. Something which is more or less equivalent to Aristotle's sensitive soul. This is also the title of the book that I'm writing with Simona Ginsburg, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. And what we're using is an evolutionary transition approach. We say, when we're thinking about it, we think about that there were three major kind of intrinsically teleological transitions in evolution. The transition to life, to consciousness, and to rationality. And we use the transition to living entities as a guiding heuristics. We think that when people have started thinking about the transition to life in an evolutionary context, a lot of the problems and a lot of the pseudo-problems that existed when people were trying to figure out what exactly life is and what are the boundaries of life versus non-life and so on and so forth, dissolved. And we hope that by using a kind of similar strategy, we will manage to dissolve some of the problems of what consciousness is. Although we are not trying to say that there is no such thing as consciousness in the same way, of course, that we are not trying to say that there is no such thing as life. Of course there is. And the point of this talk is that we're going to have a specific kind of proposal, and that is that the evolution of learning drove the evolution of minimal consciousness. That this was the evolutionary driver of minimal consciousness in the sense that I defined it. So we're using the heuristics of the Origin of Life project, evolutionary Origin of Life project. How did people go about it? What I'm describing now is, of course, some kind of idealization, because people didn't go in exactly this way about it. They went in all kinds of directions at the same time. Nevertheless, for didactic reasons, it's a good idea to do this. And you list the necessary and sufficient characteristics of the object of study. For example, of what a living organism is. Okay, there'll be lots of people who think differently about these things. But what is interesting about when you're looking at the list that people have prepared is that there is a lot of overlap between them. A lot of overlap. Although, of course, some people think it's metabolism first, some people think it's replication first. It doesn't matter. When you put it all together, you see there is a huge overlap. Excuse me. This always happens. Right. The second thing is to suggest something that I will go into quite a lot, not a lot, a little here, and that is a transition marker. Some capacity of the system, or a property of the system, that requires that for this capacity to exist, there must be an encompassing, enabling system that satisfies the criteria, all the criteria for the system, for life or for consciousness. Then, if we're lucky, we can, if we can, is to construct a toy model that spells out the dynamic organization that can instantiate such a system from the capacity, from the marker, evolutionary marker. Then point to evolutionary scenario, to the when, where, and how did such a process happen, and how it reframes philosophical questions. Once we agree, if we agree, that this is a valid project. Okay, so let's have a look at the transition for life, at the marker for the transition of life. And here I'm building on the work of Tibor Ganti, a Hungarian chemist, a theoretical chemist, and on the work of John Maynard Smith and Ernst Satmary on their analysis of life in their book, The Major Transitions in Evolution. And what they did there, I will not go into the many things they did in this book, but when they were talking about life and when they defined a capacity, and it was the capacity for unlimited heredity, as the capacity that once it exists in a chemical system, will make this system a system of sustainable life. It's an important point. It is a system of sustainable life, because maybe there are we're not going into a lot of definitions here, because there are gray areas which we really cannot define in evolutionary biology. It's a characteristic of any evolutionary thinking. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And so, but once you have this capacity, then yes, there is here a system of sustainable life. And what they suggested was that the marker, the evolutionary marker for sustainable life, is unlimited heredity. And that is a system where the number of hereditary variations is practically unlimited. Of course, mathematically it is limited, but practically unlimited, and evolution is therefore open-ended. And this contrasts with a system of limited heredity, where you have a relatively small number of variants that are possible. And of course, the number of variants that are possible is smaller than the environments, and therefore it's not a sustainable system, because sooner or later an environment will come that will destroy the system. And it does not have the capacity to respond to it. So unlimited heredity is their marker. And when you are trying to analyze what kind of system can enable a system, can be an enabling system for unlimited heredity, you come very interestingly with something like quite a complex autopoietic system. Not quite like a cell, but not that far from it. So and unlimited heredity, they claim, is a good marker for a transition to sustainable life. And I think this is a very important and valid point. So can we point out to something that is a similar marker for consciousness, and can we then use it in order to reverse engineer the enabling system? It's a very big project, of course. I'm not claiming we did it, but we're starting. We think it's a good way of starting working on it. So let's start with the list. We went through hundreds of lists by philosophers and by neurobiologists and cognitive biologists who gave us characteristics of consciousness without sort of circularity, without saying, this is subjectivity. Well, if it's subjectivity, that's the end of the story, right? But all kinds of capacities that people believe are individually necessary and jointly sufficient to describe something like a system that, when it has all these capacities, all of them, it can be said, well, it is a very likely thing that this is a conscious system. So we're talking about flexible values, so that valence can be attributed to many, many different things, positive or negative. We're talking about unity and diversity through all kinds of sensory binding, so we don't see just we see the apple as green and round, and it has a center all at the same time. And each of these things separately, we can react to them very, very differently if they are separate from the whole. There is global availability of information involving multidirectional feedback and reentrant interactions, implying causal efficacy of mental states. I will not go into it. It's a big argument. There is temporal but global availability means that a lot of different modalities can interact. There is a kind of global, and there is a kind of image, not only of the world, but of the body in the world and of the individual as an active agent acting with a body, acting in the world. People are talking about temporal thickness, about sensory temporal persistence, about selection. The selection principle is enormously important. The idea that exploration and selective stabilization at different levels are absolutely crucial to our understanding of what processes that are underlying consciousness are is very, very widespread. And the idea is that this kind of selective stabilization leads through inhibitions to serial information processing and includes processes of selective attention. We're talking about intentionality, aboutness, and here I will just put the simplest and common sense way of thinking about it, simply mapping of the body, mapping of the world in a distal system. And we're talking about embodiment, agency, and self, the integration of there is no conscious organism that doesn't have a body. I'm talking about consciousness as we know it. I'm not talking about consciousness of computers. I'm not talking about robots. I'm talking about consciousness as we know it, the only consciousness that we are aware of. And this is what I want to understand. So we're talking about embodiment, about agency, and about self, absolutely crucial notions for people who are doing consciousness studies. The organism, one, must distinguish itself from the world, and it does. And again, here we come to the kind of ideas that Björn Merker has been talking about reafference as an absolutely crucial aspect of, and as I will argue, quite complex reafference, not any reafference, not peripheral reafference, but central reafference is very, very important for an organism that we can define that we can attribute consciousness to. Now, so we were looking for what is it that we can use as a marker. Some capacity that will be general enough, not specific to insects, not specific to cephalopods, not specific to vertebrates. Something general that when we find it, we can say, well, there is a good chance that this is a conscious, that the system enabling this, not the actual capacity, of course, is conscious. And we have been rather influenced by Minor Smith and Satmary and Ganti, and after we looked for a year for all kinds of markers, from the molecular to the neurobiological, we didn't know what we were looking for. And in the end, sort of for us, the penny dropped, and we defined something that we call unlimited associative learning. It's a specific form of classical and operant associative learning that satisfies several conditions. It's not simple associative learning. It has to satisfy the following three conditions, which are not enormously complicated, but in fact they are. Once you look at them, you see that the enabling system has to be bloody complex. So the first one is that the conditional stimulus, or the behavior, the pattern of behavior, the pattern of action is compound, that it consists of several fused features, color, shape, texture, and or patterns of action that are learned as a conjunction rather than separately. It's not 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. It's all together. The totality of this thing is different from the sum of its parts. Different, not greater or smaller, different. And it is novel. It is neither reflex eliciting nor pre-associated through learning with an unconditional stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, and with a reinforcement, or with a reinforcing through previous learning. So it's neither kind of innate, nor is it already have been already learned. And the third is that the learned CS, the learned conditional stimulus, or the learned sequence of actions can subsequently support second-order conditioning, acting itself as a US or reinforcement. Okay, so there is a second-order learning. That's all. Now, and then we ask the question, okay, first of all, why did we feel that it's a good one? It's not just an intuition based on unlimited heredity. It's because the number of associations that can be learned by an animal that can learn in this way and is huge. It's much, much greater than anything than the number of environments that it can meet. So we have here not unlimited open-ended evolution, but a kind of open-ended ontogeny, ontogenetic learning. Now, then we ask ourselves, okay, let's say we have such a system. What does it entail? What do we need to have in order for such system to exist in the first place in an animal? What kind of nervous system do we need, and so on and so forth? By the way, we believe that only central nervous system can work. So there must be mechanisms, first of all, that integrate the various underlying features of whatever it is that is represented to form a compound, a composite. And that the encoding must be multi-stage, hierarchical and predictive. We do believe that predictive coding is enormously important. We think that there is both top-down and bottom-up flow of information. We know that there is, and we have been very impressed. I know that there are many different opinions, probably here as well as elsewhere, but we have been very, very impressed by the work of Carl Friston and his colleagues, and Andy Clark and Howie in Australia. We think this kind of framework is very, very useful. There must be a dedicated memory system, that's the second thing, that enables subsequent retrieval based on the learned compound patterns. So it's not just a local kind of memory. We have to have some kind of dedicated memory system that can store a lot of composites of different types. And the evaluation system must be able to assign valence to any compound input. Now, I have here very, very simple toy models for what we called world learning and self-learning, and then a compound. The only thing to see, to take home from these models, I can explain them, but we have no time, and this is a toy model of a toy model. Yes, I have the original toy model if somebody wants to have headache. So what we need to have is our sensory units, integrating sensory units. We have to have motor integrating units. The sensory units take exteroceptive, interoceptive, proprioceptive information. The motor units, motor units unite this proprioceptive and interoceptive information and model the action of the animal in the world. We have to have value systems that are not inherent in a particular stimulus, but that they can be applied to any set of stimuli. And we have to have association units that associate between the motor units that are the high-level motor units that are integrating the information from the body, from the action, and from the body and the world. And we have to have a memory store unit, which is dedicated. And the arrows here say that between each of these, there are several hierarchical levels. And this is a very, very simple model of associative learning. This is a model of self-learning, when you learn about the self. This is a model about both. And the point is that when you are looking at, when you are going back to the list, and you are looking at what is required from UAL, what you see is that it satisfies all the set of criteria. All the set of criteria have to be satisfied for something like that to work at all. Again, I will not go into it for 2.5 minutes of time. Now, the point is that if we are looking, and then we said, okay, so who has it? Who is learning by UAL in the animal world? And what we see is that there are 3 groups of animals that we can see. Some arthropods, most vertebrates, and some mollusks. The cephalopod mollusk, surprise, surprise. And we know that the arthropods and the vertebrates that seem to have it evolved in the Cambrian, and the cephalopods, the colloid cephalopods, evolved 300 million years later. Now here it is. This is a kind of summary, and what we see here are the 36 phyla of animals. I mean, some people say 34, some people say 36, never mind. We took a very influential and good tree, we think. And what we see is all this, those that don't have circles don't have a brain. Again, what is a brain, what is not a brain, it's a very, very difficult thing to define. But according to most criteria, they don't have a brain. Those with a circle do have a brain. Those with a circle which has gray in it can learn by association, but not open-ended. Only those with the rays can learn by UAL. Now, we also argue that the evolution of associative learning, rather than any kind of particular sensory capacity, has been the driving force of the Cambrian explosion. It is behind, it's mainly the arthropods. We believe that it started with the arthropods very, very quickly. The vertebrates evolved it in parallel, we think, although there are huge analogies between the vertebrate brain and the insect brain. So we're not sure it's really total analogy, but there may be some kind of organization in the common ancestor. And we think that it led to a lot of arms races, and these arms races led to the incredible diversity that we see in the Cambrian. So we generalized the kind of ideas that it was sight that drove the Cambrian explosion, or all kinds of other ideas that maybe the olfactory, the evolution of olfactory senses, and so on. Now, I don't think I have time to go into it. These are very common. People very commonly say, well, do you have to have UAL in order to be conscious? No, of course not. A baby is conscious, and it doesn't learn by unlimited associative learning. The UAL is a positive marker of animal consciousness. Its presence tells us that an animal is endowed with minimal consciousness, but its absence cannot determine whether or not an animal is non-conscious. And we have to remember that a human that doesn't have a a baby or a person who has severe brain damage, who cannot learn by UAL, nevertheless experiences. And we have to remember that the enabling system of UAL is in place even in incapacitated or ontogenetically very immature individuals. So this is in place, and it is the enabling system that allows consciousness. And we have to remember that, and the example is that, we have, if a cell is alive even after you take its nucleus out. For example, erythrocytes, they live for 120 days. They don't divide, but they live. They metabolize and so on. So they don't have an unlimited heredity system. They don't have a nucleus, right? But nevertheless, they live. Evolutionarily, of course, and developmentally, it's a dead end. We also believe that if an animal has lost its UAL capacity, which we believe happens several times in evolution, it will eventually also lose consciousness. So I think that consciousness is losable, like everything else in this world. Okay. Now, I want to finish with James, inevitably. And James, when he was thinking about consciousness, he said, consciousness is a fighter for ends, of which many, but for its presence, would not be ends at all. And we argue that it is a mistake to think about the functions of consciousness. Life doesn't have a function. Life has a goal. There are many capacities of a living system that do have functions. But life itself doesn't have a function. In the same way, we think consciousness doesn't have really a function. Yes, of course, it cannot contradict survival and reproduction, right? But that's trivial. It is a system of goals. And the emergence of consciousness led to the generation of a new functional realm. Thank you very much.
Time for a couple of questions.
Hey, thank you very much. So in your talk, oh, great, thank you. So at one point you sort of tabled the thought of what about sort of computational or sort of computer-based systems, but sort of thinking about unlimited associative learning, I think of the advances in machine learning and wonder if you have any thoughts about their sort of conscious properties and perhaps the enabling systems that may or may not be present in those software.
Yes. We have thought about it, obviously. It's impossible not to think about it with this subject. And what I can tell you is this. Think about a system that uses an unlimited heredity system. For example, a genetic algorithm implemented in a chip, in a computer chip. You will not say that the chip is alive because it implements an unlimited heredity system, right? So the implementation here is enormous. There's something about the implementation here that is very, very important. Although maybe you can say, well, if I find something like that, maybe I can deduce that somebody intelligent and alive did it. But that's a different matter. That's a very, very different. So, okay, so that's the first thing. Now, when we're thinking about robots and about, we did a big survey also on deep learning and things like that to see what has been achieved, what has not been achieved. And, there was this recent paper by Day1 in Science where they sort of also did a survey which is very similar to what we did. There are beginnings of domain general associative learning, really domain general, without millions and millions and millions of trials. And but basically, yes, I believe that there will be robots or machines that will implement unlimited associative learning. They will not be conscious for the same reason that the computer chip is not alive. Nevertheless, if you ask me if I think that if we will be able to have conscious robots, my gut feeling is yes. I think it will be a much more complex system than the one that we think about. I think the analogies with life will go very much further. There is, as you probably know, developmental robotics. People are doing developmental robotics and getting very interesting results where the robots develop. Now, they develop only cognitively. They don't develop morphologically. Shall we need morphological development as well in order for the body to change and to learn through body changes? Possibly. You know, I think also our way of thinking about memory, we're thinking about synaptic memory, Hebbian kind of networks. I don't think it's enough. We know today that there is a hell of a lot of epigenetic systems that store memory at the level of chromatin structures. And we know that little RNAs can migrate between cells and can take information from one level to another level. I think we are thinking about memory in a very primitive way today. But we'll get there one day, right? We are improving all the time. So I think that when we shall have to learn more from biology. I think that there are not that many shortcuts, as many as we think, to robots, but maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, let's take one more and get the panel on stage to Johan. And in the meantime, why don't we get the other panelists?
Yes, both you and the previous speaker emphasized the importance of the ability to learn and flexible behavior to have consciousness. But
can you please repeat it? Sorry.
yes, both you and the previous speaker emphasized the ability to have flexible behavior and learning as a sign of consciousness. But isn't it a paradox that some of our strongest feelings of thirst, pain, etc., are instinctive and not learned behaviors? They are unconditioned stimuli, and they give rise to very strong conscious feelings that are not learned.
You're absolutely right. And this was also a point that was made by Denton when he was talking about the imperative power of the primordial emotions. But the question is, where did it come from? Where did these very strong feelings come from? And we argue that it comes from the evolution of learning. But this is where it comes from. We don't say that once you have evolved these systems, of course, you will feel them immediately, and it will be imperative.
Yeah. Another thing also, you said that some mollusks, and I mentioned cephalopods again, have this ability, but what about aplysia? That can also have associated learning, right? So,
yes. Aplysia has very limited associative learning. It has associative learning. It can, by the way, learn also by very simple operant conditioning, instrumental conditioning, not just Pavlovian word learning. But it's very, very limited. What it cannot do is to create the compounds and learn about the compounds. And it does have second-order learning, by the way. It does have it, arguably. But we wrote to Kandel and to people to ask about this, and it seems like yes, but only for very, very, very simple and non-composite kind of actions and percepts.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we now have a little bit of time for panel discussion and group discussion. I thought I might just kick things off by asking, I'm interested in criteria for the ascription of consciousness. Eva talked about, it seems that a lot of your general attitudes and verdicts about the presence of consciousness in specific organisms depend on having some underlying general criteria for ascribing the presence or absence of consciousness. Eva talked about positive markers and negative markers, and in general the focus here was on positive markers for consciousness, kinds of behavior or kinds of processing which when present give you reason to think consciousness is present. But in this particular context, the issue in thinking about when consciousness first evolved, we can't just be happy with positive markers, right? We also need negative markers, criteria for the absence of consciousness. Everyone, I think, made some claims about where consciousness first comes in. Todd very explicitly, this guy was the first. Peter saying that consciousness arose a couple of times independently, maybe in octopuses and vertebrates, which suggests that the common ancestor, I guess some kind of worm, is not conscious. Andrew very explicitly in his claims that these unification mechanisms are necessary, and Eva in that the capacity for associative learning is necessary. So I guess I'm interested in being really explicit about what these negative markers are, these criteria for these necessary conditions for consciousness, criteria for the absence of consciousness are, and what really are our reasons for believing that those things are necessary for consciousness. Stephen, in the previous talk, was saying, well, come on, consciousness is really simple. It's maybe it's just a matter of a simple ouch for a little subjective experience. Why do you need unification for that? Why do you need associative learning for that? Why do you need flexible behavior for that? So I guess I'm curious to hear, A, what are, in your view, the negative markers for consciousness? How do we know that they're criteria for the absence of consciousness? Or is it simply a lack of positive evidence for them being markers of consciousness? Curious, anyone can take that one.
I think that the way I view it, since there are so many criteria for an absence, I mean, death is a clear criteria for absence of consciousness. But I would say, when we look at it, we think of the distinction between reflexive behaviors and non-reflexive behaviors. I think that's a very reasonable starting point. I think that gets to the question of, well, if a computer can do it, or if a zombie can do it, or if it can be done in the absence of consciousness by humans, therefore you have to throw out the entire arguments that pretty much all four of us have made. And I don't accept those arguments, because humans, in the absence of consciousness, do not do all of the things that we're talking about here. They cannot. We're highly dependent upon consciousness. Again, I think that you could probably generate a number of...
Some aspects of consciousness are highly reflexive, right? Like pain?
No, conscious pain is not highly reflective. It can be done. You can have a comatose patient who will withdraw to a thumb or a pinprick. You can have a patient with a spinal cord lesion who will withdraw to a noxious stimulus. So it's not necessary in the human model to have behaviors that would be conscious were they conscious. Okay, so again, I think that the problem is we argue about sort of minutia a little bit, and yeah, there's a much bigger, obvious picture going on here. And I would add that if you want to, one potential model is to look at the distinction between reflexive behaviors and non-reflexive. And I think, wouldn't you agree that that's sort of implicitly what you're looking at with the bees, for example, that you're saying that this is too complex to be reflexes, or it's too complex to be just, and aren't you saying that with the octopus, that this is not just a motor program running through? You're saying this is a non-reflexive behavior.
Okay, let's move to somebody else.
Just want to tell you about an experiment which is very interesting that was done in Sweden in the 90s. In this experiment, what they did, they tried to condition people. They presented them with a complex picture of sunflowers in a field, with a lot of patterns and things like that, but they masked it. People were not aware that they saw it, and then they gave them a little electric shock. And then they wanted to see whether the people have learned this. They did also a control experiment. The control experiment was they presented the people with something that they had been exposed to in the past, like angry faces, also masked it, and also gave them a little shock, and looked to see whether they have been conditioned or not. The result was that the people who have been presented with the new and novel and unanticipated kind of landscape picture did not become conditioned. The people who were presented with the face did become conditioned, although in both cases they reported absolutely no. They didn't see anything. So I think what we have to do is to look at this type of experiments. I'm not trying to build everything on one experiment, right? But it's a very telling experiment, and we found it also only after we've developed this, which was very gratifying. Nevertheless, I think this, and what we want to see is, what can you not learn? What can you not, really, what can't you learn? What can't you get when you are not conscious? And this will tell us something about this negative aspect. This is the only way that we can do it, and I think we can do experiments. And in fact, we're planning some experiments, simpler experiments than those done by the Swedish group, but similar in concept, to explore this idea, and to try and find out also, maybe we can do it also with, in humans, we can do a lot of things we can't do with other animals. So.
Yeah, a bit about negative markers. So, right, it's a good question. I think what one will say about that is dependent upon the background of some sort of theory about what sort of thing consciousness is or subjective experience. I think the right sort of bridging concepts in this area between mental and physical are the family of concepts around the idea of subjectivity. So for that reason, I'd be looking for reasons to think that something isn't a subject. Now, I don't think I have a lot of detail worked out on that front, but here are two informative negative cases where I think you can sort of start to draw some rough lines. So among living things, single-celled organisms have a certain kind of unity, and they can sense and they can respond to what they sense. And that's a kind of beginning, but they're very, very simple with respect to those properties. On the other side, a plant, like an ordinary tree, which some people do talk about more in this connection now than they used to, it's much more complicated, but it lacks the kind of integration that an animal has, where the kind of integration that an animal has that's relevant, I think of, is pretty much entirely the consequence of the existence of a nervous system. A nervous system ties a body together in a way that a plant is not tied together as a body. So in the case of an animal with a nervous system and an animal with reasonable unity, you have the requisite complexity and the requisite unity. In the case of a single-celled organism, you don't have the requisite complexity. In the case of a plant, you don't have the requisite unity. So those are the sort of steps from which I'd be proceeding in answering your question.
Did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, can I pick up, so to pick up on what Peter said about the need for basically subject and subjectivity and unity, I completely agree with that, and I want to sort of pick up on the ouch thing as well and possibly clarify that. So for example, if we think about, so I think a bee, it has a subject and has subjectivity. If a bee experiences a noxious stimulus, every aspect of the bee's behavior is changed. It shows a change in affect. So it doesn't just change that it avoids the pain, but also it doesn't want to forage for a while. It devalues sugar rewards. There is a complete change in the entire responses of the subject in response to a noxious stimulus. If we take a nervous system that I don't think is able to support either unity or subjectivity, like a box jellyfish, you can give that an ouch. You can hit a part of its body wall, and it will, that part of the body wall then changes how it fires, that causes the whole organism to move away from the ouch. But if you silence just that part of the body wall that you gave the ouch to, it will go straight back towards where it was doing before. There is no unified subject that has experienced the ouch. It is localized to one part of the body wall, one part of the rhodopalium.
That's very helpful.
Thank you. I tried.
Okay, we'll go to the audience now. Over there. I'm sorry.
Thanks. You know, I mean, in some ways or another, it seems like what you're all up to is trying to figure out which species or kinds of animals are subjects of the life. And what I keep thinking of, which I'm curious about, is, and historically we only assign consciousness to people, but now we're thinking about aspects of consciousness that extend beyond that. So then it has me thinking about the capacity for intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity, the ability for two beings to share a subjective understanding, to sympathize with the other, to take the role of the other, or some aspect of that, is a thing that historically we've marked as something that only humans can do, but now there seems to be evidence of intersubjectivity between animals of the same species that are non-human, or perhaps even between across species. And so I'm curious about if there's that kind of mapping of the capacity for intersubjectivity, and where where some people are thinking about where those lines get drawn or redrawn.
I can say something very quick. One of the helpful features of the octopus is the fact that they break all sorts of rules with respect to things like this. They're a short-lived, mostly solitary animal with little interest in the internal states of other octopuses, except in very specific circumstances. But they have such richness and such apparently sort of subjectivity-appropriate profiles of behaviour. So when people lean very hard on the social character of the mind and extend that to the animal case, I like to wheel in my octopus.
Yes, but the octopus has a lot of interactions with predators and prey. And this is also a sort. It's not interspecies interaction, but it is. It's not intraspecies interaction, but it's interspecies interaction. So I think that the richness of interactions, it is a kind of social interactions. Well, we may not think about it like that, but it is. Between predators, preys, is enormous in the octopus. They are very tasty. Everybody wants to eat them, and they are great predators. And so I think this is a kind of, and I think, in fact, that maybe in some jumping spiders, the story is similar. They are also solitary, but they're great predators, and they're preys, too. And when you have this kind of very rich predator-prey interaction, I think this should be construed as social, too. So we have and in fact, it is true that in vertebrates, and are not all of them, but many, certainly mammals, are very social by definition. Everybody has a mother. And many of the social insects are social insects. And in fact, the social animals, and also the octopus, the mammals, the birds, which are inherently social, the social insects and the octopus are not just able to do UAL, which is what I'm talking about. They are able to, they're already at a different level already. They're at the level of what Dennett called Popperian organisms. They have imagination. They have episodic-like memory. And I think this is to some extent related to the kind of very rich world of interactions which they inhabit.
Okay, let's go to another question. Let's see, let's survey the whole
I think I can say this loudly. You presented earlier, one of you, a triangle, which was desire, action, world. You've spoken, all four of you have spoken to a very limited degree about desire and where it arises in this process. And it seems to me that that's a major component of consciousness, but in general, the commentary has been silent on where that functionally might arise, or how it arises, or does it arise, and is it necessary to have consciousness that you have desires?
Anyone want to take the question on desire?
I think that in the model that I have presented, you cannot have the kind of learning that we're talking about. In fact, you cannot have any learning at all if you don't have a reinforcement system. You cannot, in the way that I'm thinking about it, you cannot think about target selection, learning about the world, about learning about your own actions, and action selection. You can't think about all these things without some kind of reinforcement system which provides the motivation. This is what Björn Merker has been talking about. And the reinforcement system is absolutely crucial. All these things are tied together. I think you cannot think, in my way of thinking, and here I do not agree with Todd Feinberg, I don't think you can think about affective consciousness separately from perceptual consciousness. I think all these things it's a unified system, and all these things have to happen together, including the motor representation. Of course, different animals will give different weight to different aspects of this and in different ways to this three components. But they have to be in place, all of them.
That reminds me that I wanted to give people on the panel a chance to ask questions to each other, in particular where there I think there were disagreements among yourselves to press on. So just mention one. Peter, do you have something you want to say?
Well, I disagree a little with what Eva just said. So the idea that there's really a packaged deal here, and that if you have the evaluative side, you've got to have the sensory side and vice versa with respect to the bearing of these things on subjective experience. It might be that way, but I'm not seeing a reason to think it's that way, and that's partly why I think it's helpful that we have those terrestrial arthropods who seem to be so sophisticated on the sensory side. They have to fly, for God's sake. Very difficult thing to do. You've got to have a very good handling of space and of the relationship between your own motions and the stream of input, all that kind of thing in order to fly. And that alone seems to be a reason to believe in something like sensory consciousness in these animals of the sort, for example, that Todd talks about. And so far as I can see, that argument gets some purchase even if these guys are evaluatively very, very simple. And because they have brains that are subject to natural selection for miniaturization, as Shelley Adamo has emphasized in this connection, I don't see any problem with the idea that you can have an animal that had a point of view in the richest possible sense of the term, the sort of sense that Thomas wants us to explain, but is evaluatively very sort of flat because it has no reason to have evaluative richness. To me, the separation looks very possible in principle. And maybe the other way. I mean, I'm very cautious about the other direction. And I think it's interesting that it's so easy to think of a sensorily rich and evaluatively weak animal and to look for real cases, but so difficult to look for and find evaluatively rich and sensorily weak animals.
I just wanted to say that I find it amazing how much we agree. I mean, I was just saying that it's like incredible.
Sorry, I did a bad job. I did a bad job then.
No, but I can tell you that 5 or 6 years ago, you would get killed if you were talking about this stuff and arguing. And then it seems like we've all arrived at this pretty much the same conclusions. It's just of interest, I think.
Anyone want to take issue with that?
Well, obviously I disagree with. With this I don't.
I'm going to use that one.
I take issue with him. And I think, of course, I mean, there will be if you have a very, very short-lived animal that, yes, you will have, and you know, all it can do is this is good, this is bad. I don't know what you mean by evaluative system. We're not talking about complex emotions, are we? Although we might in some animals. But the point is about the flexibility of this reinforcement system. How flexible is it? If they can do all kinds of very, very complex sensory discriminations, if they can move in the world and have spatial learning in a complex way, I mean, this has to be reinforced. They have to remember this kind of thing. Somehow, reinforcement has to come into play. So I think that, especially if you think about it evolutionarily, maybe after that, yes, you shorten the life so much that you hardly need to learn at all. But evolutionarily, I don't see how you can get there without a kind of an evaluative system.
We need Andy to weigh in on this. You know more about reward systems and invertebrates than most people.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do is trying to disentangle two concepts, which is a reinforcement system and an affect system. And I don't see them necessarily being the
same.
The same thing. In that a reinforcement system, I think, can be phenomenally old and also very, very simple. But I don't see that naively equating to a system of affect. I think that's why I'm being quite quiet at the moment, because I think that we may be talking about slightly different things here.
Yeah. When you look at an animal like, for example, a dragonfly or a wasp with very difficult sensory motor capacities, but I don't know much about dragonflies, but I think a rather regimented life, do you see an animal that has all the point of view stuff but is evaluatively kind of flat, or do you not see that? What's your hunch as someone who works on these sorts of animals?
So there's there's remarkable little work on the learning capacities of dragonflies, but the hunch would be that they certainly have the similar sorts of capacities that I would expect for a fruit fly. But the learning capacities do vary in insects in interesting ways. So some of the work that I have been doing, which is probably related to this, is that one of the famous papers in honeybees is that bees can learn abstract concepts. And we've been looking at neurally how that might be plausible in a nervous system like a bee. And we've recognized that there needs to be a feedback pathway that is developed in a bee, but is not developed in something like a fruit fly. So a honeybee might be able to have that sort of capacity for a limited form of abstract concept learning. I'd expect that to be not so well developed for a fruit fly. I think I'm now sort of rambling, but what I'm trying to get to is that the neat thing about insects is that we do actually have systems where we can try and relate capacities to nervous structures, and then possibly even test those hypotheses.
Okay, maybe we've got time for one
question
or
here?
two more. What do you got, Henry, there?
Yeah, this actually delves into my question as well, Andrew. I'm trying to figure out what you're talking about with your honeybees. What's important is understanding necessary and sufficient criteria for consciousness. I think you need to solve the binding problem, number one, necessary but not sufficient, and the other one is selective attention. So in terms of humans and vertebrates, I think you need a cortical thalamic loop. With insects, you don't have a cortex, you don't have a thalamus, but yet you're saying that they have, you kind of bound things together and they have selective attention. Therefore, maybe you have what's necessary but not sufficient for awareness. I don't know. I mean, my wife works with Drosophila and she thinks that it's something to be a Drosophila, which may be true. But I guess what you're saying is you don't have to have those structures, but if you have something analogous in an insect or a different substrate, then you can have the beginnings of something that can create consciousness. But you haven't proven that it's actually conscious or has anything it's like to be that bee.
So first of all, yes, I agree with your wife.
I agree with her too.
Second, yes, I think you've got my main point. I'm talking about basically a functional analogy. So yes, there is no cortex, there is no corticothalamic loop or anything like that in the insect brain. There are certainly evidence-based neural signatures for selective attention and processing and things like that. It's functional analogy I'm talking about, not anatomical homology. And I've forgotten what the third point I was trying to make there. What was your last point?
And do you think that
have
insects...
I proven it? Have I proven consciousness in insects? No, I would agree with you. I haven't proven it.
Right.
But I've said that I don't think that we should rule out the possibility just because their nervous system looks different to us.
Bees are more likely to be conscious than Drosophila?
No, I think that they both have the capacity for the most basic form of awareness, but the contents of their consciousness will be radically different.
Okay, Sharon Street.
Thank you. This question is, I think, mainly for Andrew. Just very interested in this idea of bees and whether you mentioned that you think they do have affective experience. And I was wondering, when you said you suggested that it's not just that when it experiences a noxious stimulus, one of the signs is it then, it loses its interest, at least from it appears in sugar and that sort of thing. I'm curious to hear more about. I mean, this relates to Peter Godfrey Smith's sort of the sensory versus the evaluative side of experience. And like if we're trying to think about the bee, I'm finding it plausible that it might have sensory experience, but this idea of, but it seems easy to imagine that its evaluative experience is flat or even maybe non-existent. I wonder about that. And so in a way, why you might think that it experiences a noxious stimulus, and it stops drinking sugar or going after sugar for a while, but why not think that's sort of just a purely causal result of the noxious stimulus? Like, why think there's, that the world is presenting to it as good or bad or pleasant or unpleasant? Like, what makes you think, no, you're inclined to think it does have affect of a certain kind?
Short answer is yes. But the papers I want to point you to, there's work by two authors. First of all, the work by Geraldine Wright, who was looking at negative affect in insects and bees. using a noxious stimulus and then showing how it changed their evaluations of positive stimuli, and basically inducing a negative cognitive bias in a whole range of behaviors following a noxious stimulus. More recently, work by a colleague of mine, Clint Perry, who had a paper looking at how basically looking at emotion-like behavior in bumblebees. And there it was giving the bees a positive experience and then showing an induction of a positive cognitive bias to a whole range of stimuli, including being less worried or alarmed by a threat of a crab spider. So it was a whole wide-ranging suite of changes in behavior interpreted as a positive cognitive bias following a positive rewarding stimulus, described as emotion-like behavior, or described as positive affect. So those are two authors to follow up on. And also Clint Perry has a review that has been accepted now, so I can talk about it, coming out soon on in exactly this issue in Journal of Experimental Biology.
Okay, last one from Ned.
So, in humans, humans are capable of what is called covert attention, which is attention to something without moving your eyes. So that shows an attention system that is independent of eye movement. I'm wondering if insects can do that.
That's to me, I take it. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is actually really interesting because a lot of insects, so Drosophila particularly, have almost 360-degree vision, period. They do saccades to move things into the frontal period of view, but that work I was talking about with the fan-shaped body. So basically, they can see all objects in their panoramic field of view all the time. The fan-shaped body has a capacity to then rotate the center of the neural signature of selective attention rotates within the fan-shaped body to fixate on the thing that the organism needs to pay attention to. That triggers the fly to saccade and reorient towards it. So that's a movement of selective attention that's preceding and causing the head movement and the eye movement. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And what are the effects of that selective attention other than the refocusing of the eyes?
So the effects of selective attention are, it is the neural signature that predates what the animal is about to focus on. So we see that window shifting their attention to what they're going to focus on as a neural signature, then their behavior changes and they reorient towards it.
But does it change the actual perception? So in humans, when you attend to something without moving your eyes, you increase the represented level of contrast in the visual system. Does that happen in insects?
This is where we're pushing the level of available evidence and my knowledge of it. So I don't want to basically go beyond what I can talk about here.
I bet you the answer is yes.
We'll go with that for now.
The fact that Ned has the mic, or had it, makes me want to ask a question to Ned. So Ned asked a question to Andy where Andy had said, here's some things bees can do. And Ned said, well, we know that people can do all that stuff unconsciously. So why is all this stuff telling us something about consciousness? Andy's reply was, look, I didn't put them up as criteria for consciousness. This was just to make you think that bees are not sort of insignificant robots after all. But the way that Ned asked his question made me curious. So part of my talk was designed to sort of head off a certain objection I thought you might make at some point in proceedings, which is a relative at least of the one that you made to Andy. So it's true, and I associate this with sort of the sorts of work that you're involved in, interested in, NYU-ish work in some ways, where you try to get as long a list as possible of the sorts of things that people can do unconsciously. And I think of this as yet a tacit argument, although maybe it's explicit, maybe you or others have made the argument explicitly. A person might say, well, here's our list of things people can do unconsciously. It's a pretty good list of animal capacities, so why shouldn't we infer that to be an animal doesn't require consciousness of any kind? Because all you have to do is do all these things, and all these things we know in humans can be done unconsciously. So I wanted to one part of my talk was designed to sort of head that off, or at least confront it ahead of time, by saying there wouldn't be a direct argument of that form, because in the experiments that we're talking about here, the people are always conscious of something else as all this stuff is going on. So there's no argument yet that sort of doing what's involved in being an awake, acting person, there's no argument that you can be that without being conscious of something. And that makes me resist a kind of compositional argument where you sort of take all those capacities that have been done unconsciously, put them together into an animal profile and say, here's my unconscious animal. So I'm trying to resist an argument I don't know if anyone's actually made in those terms, but I'm very curious as to whether you would endorse an argument of that form and whether that's part of what was in your mind when you were making your objection to Andy.
Yeah. So, yes, that was in my mind. And Andy gave pretty much the same answer that you just gave, which is that these unconscious capacities that we can find in humans all are in the context of a conscious being that has other conscious capacities at the same time. So maybe a good place to focus actually in humans would be the dorsal visual system. So, you know, we can do all the dorsal visual system seems to be a completely unconscious system. It can work much faster than the conscious ventral visual system. You know, it can control movements that the conscious ventral system isn't even aware of. But of course, that all happens within the context of a being that has that conscious ventral system. So, yeah, I'm sympathetic with that. I think it could be that the approach I was basically suggesting, I think you say correctly. You know, we haven't shown consciousness in insects if there are things that they can do things that humans can do unconsciously. Maybe that isn't exactly right. Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to your response.
Pass it back to Heather, who has something urgent to say.
Just something to add to that, I really like that argument because I'm along the line with Ned, and I'm really interested in the unconscious and everything that it can do. But when you look at these split brain patients, right, where they cut the corpus callosum, and in a way you have these kind of two separate consciousnesses, let's say, in these two separate hemispheres. But the right hemisphere, we can't verbalize it, and you know, as far as we know, there's not a lot of consciousness going on there, but yet it can do a lot of complex things when we give it specific tasks, right? So in that sense, you're having unconscious processes without consciousness.
That's a good case. Why do we think there's not much consciousness going on? Maybe Todd.
Yeah, stop asking questions to the audience.
Some would say because we can't verbalize it. I know Todd's going to argue that it is conscious, but well, no. Okay, well, go on. Yeah, you can.
Anybody who studies colostomy patients recognizes that it's a separate conscious system. They just can't talk. I mean, ask Zaniga what he thinks. Yeah. Ask Sperry what he thought. I mean, that we all agree that they're two separate conscious systems that can operate independently. There's tons of data on that. It's not debatable.
Okay, I think it's gotten to the point where we better wrap things up, so let's thank our group for a fantastic session. Just before we go to lunch, we'll be gathered back here at 1:30. They've asked us to clear the place, so no one can stay here during lunch. You're welcome to leave something to mark your seat if you like, but it's at your own risk. Good luck with lunch. See you at 1:30.
One of the really dramatic things we always talk about is how different the nervous systems are. But they still have in common those special features.